it over to you, Steve. Do you want to start with roll call and then?
Very good. Okay. For the State Controller, Ms. Paquin.
Here.
For the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Mr. Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Tang.
Here.
Ms. Bradford.
Here.
And for the State Treasurer, Mr. Ruffino.
Present.
And for the Director of Finance, Ms. Miller. Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Great. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, and I have a statement here. So the CalSTRS board meetings are live web streamed, video archived, and available to the public on calstrs.com. Individuals who wish to address the board should wait for the 10-minute public comment period at the end of the agenda item the speaker wishes to address. For comments not pertaining to a specific agenda item, there will be an opportunity for additional statements at the end of the open session. Each speaker is allowed a maximum of 3 minutes to comment. However, if there is not enough time for each speaker to have 3 minutes, the timing is at the discretion of the chair. To protect the privacy of speakers under the age of 18 who wish to address the board, only their first name and affiliated organization may be provided, but other personal identifying information such as the last name, age, or school may not be shared. So since the March Teachers Retirement Board meeting, CalSTRS has received 21 emails regarding divestment from Russia, 14 emails regarding divestment from Enbridge, 9 emails requesting divestment from fossil fuels, 1 email expressing opposition to fossil fuel divestment, 2 emails requesting divestment from Toyota, 1 email requesting divestment from General Dynamics, and 90 contacts regarding a Surf Avenue construction project in New York.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And I have a couple of housekeeping reminders for all of you. I first just want to open our meeting on behalf of Joy Higa, who is our previous investment chair of this committee and has just served the committee with incredible distinction, intelligence, poise, and we wish Joy well. She's amazing, and I know we'll hear about her doing great things somewhere else, but I just wanted to give a shout out to Joy Higa and her incredible leadership. And I guess, yeah. And I am serving as the interim chair for this meeting, and we'll be making decisions around investment chair and other committee leadership at the July meeting. So you will be seeing a new investment chair in July. So I just wanted to mention this meeting is being live streamed on calstrs.com. While face coverings are no longer required, please give each other space. There's an overflow room right over here to my left, your right, across the hall, and it's open and streaming the board meeting if you need a little more space. Restrooms are out the door on the east side and to the left. There's another set of restrooms that are off the main lobby, directly across from the elevators to the parking garage. There's attendance sign-in sheets as well as public comment request forms. And Diane, if you could just raise your hand in the back. That's Diane Stanton in the back. And so for those who are interested in offering public comment, we'd appreciate you filling out the request form to Diane so that we can make sure that you're put in the queue for public comment. During public comment, there'll be a timer running on the screen. Please respect the time limit set for individual comments. Also, pre-recorded audios or videos are not allowed during individual comments. Last, and maybe more importantly for others, the cafe is open. The cafe is open. There's food and drink available, coffee. Lunch is available from 11 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. and coffee is available until 2. So get your caffeine now. All right. And that's it for the announcements. So with that, we'll start with approval for the committee agenda. I'd entertain a motion. It's been moved.
Second.
And seconded by Karen. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
With flexibility.
With flexibility, that's our key word, approved with flexibility. Great. So we have an approval of our committee agenda, and we're going to move to item 2, which is public comment. So opportunities for statements from the public. So Samantha, I'll hand it to you.
So we have 2 members of the public speaking on item 2. They will get 3 minutes each. Our first commenter will be Lynn.
Good morning.
Good morning.
After my mother died, my father took me to visit the Serengeti Wildlife Preserve in Tanzania. He knew I would fall in love with the sweeping plains, the astonishing wildlife, the gentle people who cared so well for their resources, and the government that promoted such guardianship. We both healed our loss as we lost ourselves in nature. We visited a fishing village on Lake Victoria and even paddled out into the cool water where we could see fish below the surface and watch the local kids swimming. As everywhere, the residents continued with their tasks and the children smiled shyly, accustomed to visitors. Such a gentle country. I can still close my eyes and replay scenes from that glorious trip. Such a privilege it was when I first caught wind of a pipeline running through Uganda, Lake Victoria, which is a critical source of water for wildlife and people for the whole region, across Tanzania to the ocean outlet where the corals are world famous. My heart clenched. Not there. Don't ruin that bit of paradise and endanger those gentle people and the wildlife. No, no, no. So here I am to ask CalSTRS how CalSTRS can even consider funding a project that would force many thousands of self-sufficient people from their homes along the lake edge, moving them inland, away from their source of food and income, their schools, their whole way of life. How can CalSTRS accept the horror of a pipeline that risks the purity of the lake's water that supports so much life, knowing oil drilling always leads to horrific unintended accidents, especially when the pipes go along or even under a lake's bed? Even a national park, Murchison Falls, will be affected. Then imagine a heated, raised pipeline crossing an entire country, breaking up migratory paths of wildebeest, disrupting the flows of creatures as they migrate in enormous herds across the country. What pipeline doesn't break and leak? In this case, toxic crude oil in pristine plains. If the crude even reaches its destination on the west coast of Tanzania, it comes out at a narrow coral channel teeming with underwater wonders that will be destroyed by oil spills. Additional shipping will also endanger the rich aquatic life in the channel. This project asks Uganda and Tanzania to give up their natural treasures and sacrifice the well-being of their people for the profits of a few. The product is more oil, which when burned will contribute even more to climate change. This deal is a disaster from a human abuse standpoint. It ruins a pristine environment, and the final product causes nothing but more harm. Why would CalSTRS seek to earn money for its pensioners from such?
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Mark.
Hello, CalSTRS board members. My name is Mark Norberg. I'm an 8th grade English teacher in Burbank, California. I'm also a state delegate to the CTA where I serve on the Financing Public Education Committee. On February 26th, I wrote an email to your External Affairs Department expressing concern about ongoing public statements made by Mr. Ailman regarding fossil fuel divestment. Time and again, Mr. Ailman has communicated that divesting from fossil fuels would harm our retirement fund. Most recently, at the February 9th Virtual Sustainability Symposium, Mr. Ailman stated that, quote, "Each and every time we divested, we lost money. Each and every time." I have long questioned the validity of these claims as they run counter to every single piece of research available. Research that shows that not only is divestment from fossil fuels not harmful, but extremely beneficial to funds. As just one local example, UC California divested their entire portfolio in 1 year and saw a 34% increase, beating CalSTRS returns for the same period. I decided to research this on my own, knowing that we had divested from coal in 2015. After acquiring a complete breakdown of the transaction, I sat down with a team of financial analysts at UC Berkeley to review the performance of these divested stocks. I asked a very simple question: did we make money, lose money, or break even on this transaction? They returned a report concluding that divestment from coal saved our fund $3 million. I sent this report to all of you, to Mr. Ailman, to Ms. Stanton, asking for you to respond to these findings. I even sent the report several weeks in advance to the CalSTRS team team participating in the CTA divestment forum and told them we would be bringing this up at the debate. Despite all of that, not only has not a single person here taken the time to respond, but at the debate, the 3 members representing CalSTRS were completely unable to refute the Berkeley findings. So I have taken the day off, bought a plane ticket, a hotel room, and flown up here to ask you in person during my 3 minutes to again, please tell me if the Berkeley report is correct or incorrect. And if you cannot, then you need to formally retract Mr. Ailman's statements to the CTA and confirm that our previous divestment from fossil fuels was beneficial to our fund. We will be presenting a resolution for divestment at the May State Council, and it will be completely unacceptable for members of our union to be deliberating and voting on this incredibly important issue while under the influence of knowingly false information. My hope is that I can finally get a response from this body without any further trips up here to do so. I thank you so very much.
Thank you for your comment. Our next speaker will be Dana.
Didn't hear her, sorry. Dana Dillon, CTA NEA retired vice president. I just wanted to express my appreciation and my organization's appreciation to CalSTRS investment team and to the board for being willing to come to State Council, CTA State Council, and participate in the forum. We really appreciate your willingness to come and speak with us at any time, even though it's a challenging time. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. That is the conclusion of comments for item 2.
Thanks, Samantha. Appreciate that. With that, thank you for public comment. And again, we always have staff follow up after public comment, so we'll ensure that staff do so. So thank you for that. Item 3, we're going to move on to the conversation around net zero. This is an information item, Kirsty. You and your team. So my understanding is this is kind of progress and planning update, and we'll have potentially kind of more to look at in the September meeting. So come on up.
So I want to share mostly with the audience so they know it. The board has asked staff to keep their presentations very concise, inside of 5 minutes. So we're going to be quick, but that allows the board more time for Q&A. So please don't misinterpret staff's speed for the fact that we're not incredibly passionate about this. Can you guys bring up the slides? They're not used to public comment going so fast. We're finding them. I'm going to jump into the first slide.
Yeah, jump
there
in.
it comes. I'm really proud of this team and what we've been working on net zero. I know it's not been fast enough for the public's sake, but internally it really has been a major lift. We basically have created 2 teams. So who's got the flipper? Somebody, you control it. We basically have 2 teams. We have a public markets team. So when you think, don't just think public equity, think about fixed income and anything liquid. That's the public markets team. And then we have a private markets team, which is anything that's held in partnerships and valued quarterly. Both teams have been meeting since last September when you made the pledge to reach net zero by 2050 or sooner. The public markets team, I'm very pleased, has already been able to measure the portfolio, and we'll get into that. That number's in the book. The private markets team is working hard on getting that because that's going to be an estimation. So you've got that first step. And remember what I said when we started. It's kind of like Waze, or think of Google Maps. You put in a destination, net zero by 2050 or sooner, but we didn't know where we were starting from. And my analogy will be, picture driving across the country. At the northern end, there's Highway 90, there's Highway 80, there's 70, 50, and I think all the way down to 20 through Arizona. You have multiple choices, and you guys know if you hit Waze or Google, it's going to show you multiple routes. This is a long journey. It is not going to be one highway, one straight path. You're going to have to make course corrections along the way. Think about 2030, 2035, 2040. And your times where you're going to be able to go really fast, and then times where you may have to slow down. So we know where we are in the public markets already, and that's our first step. Go to the next page. Thank you, Scott. Look at this graph and basically think of it as two sides of the coin. I've talked to a lot of our peers, particularly the Dutch, the British, some of the Canadian plans who are at least 6 months to a year ahead of us in the race to net zero. What I have learned from them is that they can control about half of the reduction. Decisions you can make can already impact about half of the race to net zero. But there's over half of the problem that's literally out of your hands. You do not have control over. And that is the rest of the world needs to change behavior. By 2030, and I agree with the urgency, I agree with the passion of our speakers, we want to see change. By 2030, we have to see almost only electric cars. You cannot see internal combustion engines. But this is not just transportation. The biggest challenge we have in the world is you've got to stop people from producing electricity with coal. And that's a huge problem. Yes, we divested of coal. We'll look at the numbers that were shared. So we don't own coal companies. We have no voice in that. But what we're going to try and do is influence people around it and get them to make changes. So over half of it is going to be in your control, and you're going to have to make some tough decisions in the next decade. But keep in mind that over half of it is beyond your control. It is China, it's India, it is issues like Russia, but it's also the United States government. And you've got to see GM stop making electric cars. You've got to, or only make electric cars. You've got to see people change the way they do cement, transportation, all kinds of areas. So it's going to be a challenge. Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So good morning.
You forgot how to turn on a microphone. You're on mute.
Okay, let's try this again. Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Rice. I'm a portfolio manager in the Sustainable Investments and Stewardship Strategies group. So we're on slide 4 here. So when we're thinking about influencing markets, certainly understanding that we have less control over the outcomes, but really recognizing the importance of continuing to push markets to net zero, I think the takeaway from this slide is that there are a number of tactics that we are utilizing and a number of audiences that we are addressing. So we are voting against directors at the largest global companies if they're not sufficiently managing climate risk. We are speaking directly to companies about what we expect them to do in terms of managing climate risk. And we are working to change market systems and structures to support an orderly transition to net zero. Now, moving to slide 5, in terms of our engagement escalation efforts, CalSTRS has been engaging on climate for a long time. It's a time period that's fast approaching 2 decades. More recently, in 2007, our climate engagement was escalated when the Climate Action 100 Plus program began. As you can see here in this slide, though, we are again escalating our efforts. We are voting against entire boards when companies are not demonstrating strong climate risk management. Next year, we'll be engaging these companies where we voted against the directors. What we do beyond that is still under consideration. Shareholder proposals, a possibility. Activist stewardship is a possibility. But we believe we really need to see how the engagement goes before we make final decisions on what comes next. I think certainly we'll be coming back to you to talk about what actions we will take concerning the companies that aren't willing, aren't able to transition to net zero as we need them to. And so I'll turn it over to Scott to.
All right, Scott Chan, Deputy CIO. I'm batting cleanup, as is typical. We've come a long way in a very short period of time. Push the organization and our partners. In terms of measurement, we feel that the public markets is complete. We've chosen the risk tools. We feel comfortable in our Scope 1 and Scope 2 capabilities to measure emissions. In terms of the private markets, as you might imagine, it's a work in progress. It's less transparent, there's less data. We're trying to engage our partners to capture more of that data. But in the private markets, what we think is going to be far more interesting is targeting investment solutions in the future. Now, today we weren't going to talk about our emissions reduction strategies, but I did want to preview the target setting that we'll be thinking about doing in September. So CalSTR's emissions reduction strategy will have two components. The first component is that staff will work with your board to set an aspirational target for carbon emissions in our portfolio by 2030. The second component is we'll develop an implementation target first in the public markets. So what does that entail? First and foremost, it's how to manage risk. So if we are moving in front of the markets, that entails tracking error and volatility. What does that entail in terms of our ability to reach 100% fully funded status, right? So if we think about every incremental dollar of risk that we're going to take, how are we going to maximize two things? Our expected return, as well as the impact, the carbon reductions within our portfolio. And we've talked about a range of strategies. There's divestment. If we divested from, for example, one sector, fossil fuels, and reallocated that across our global equity portfolio in all the different sectors, does that maximize return? Does it maximize our ability to capture net zero strategies? Does it maximize our ability to make impact to reduce carbon emissions within our portfolio for every dollar of risk, or does a more holistic strategy, or anything in between? So as we lay out these scenarios for the board, I think we'll have a very prudent way for us to think about the decision making. So I don't want to say a lot about investments in climate solutions, but we have been developing a framework. We call it gray, olive green. You see brown, we actually switched that to gray. We can explain a little bit more of that, but the punchline here is that it's just going to help us to manage and measure across each of our asset classes, and then we can decide upon setting targets. It's also going to push our partners to think about how to frame it as well, because we see these investments across their portfolio. So I'd like to just end by saying this, and I would be really remiss in not acknowledging the accomplishments of our SIS team. I don't think we would be anywhere close to where we are today without the leadership of Kirsty and her team. I get reflected back all the time from our partners, what a talented, great team that we have. And I think they've made a huge impact to the organization. All of our asset classes now are targeting in their top 3 priorities this net zero framework. So Chris and I are very happy with the progress that we've made to date. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions.
I didn't hear from you, and I guess I'd love to kind of, since you are the director of SIS.
Conductor doing this.
Got it. Well, the conductor sometimes gives a little intro or a little postscript,
No, thanks,
so
Sharon.
I'd love for
Happy
you
to answer any questions that we can't all collaboratively answer together.
Okay.
Thanks, so.
So questions from committee members, feel free to chime in.
Madam Chair, our thing doesn't.
Are you,
Yeah, I don't think our.
Jonathan? I think we're having, so I'm going to go old school, like classroom. Just raise your hand. So Gail first, and then Frank, Jennifer, did you have your hand? Or did you? Okay, Jennifer. Or Gail, go ahead.
Thank you. Is the mic
And
on
then-
too? Can you hear me now?
We're having issues with
It's
people
sort of
being
like
able.
Zoom after all.
I know. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? So my mic's working, but
No, that's wrong for that. Thank you.
there we go. Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay.
Miller.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jonathan. I do want to echo, especially to Ms. Jenkinson and just to your team, what an incredible lift this has been. I think it's such an amazing effort that you've made. And I think we're at kind of an inflection point now where what I'm hearing you say is you need some very strong direction from the board. And I want to talk about 2 things. One, I do think the board has made a statement with its pledge and other things, and I think what you even heard at Milken, Mr. Ailman, about the inevitability of this transition. This is not a race. This is a transition. We're all going to get there. We're all going to transition. And how we do that, I think, is important. And I think the direction from the board at this point is really important. Maybe how we expedite it a little bit. I'm thrilled to hear you talk about 2030. I think that is an important milestone. I think what we're seeing, especially, and I see Ms. Clark, I thought I did in the audience, but in terms of the Miss Kim, oh my God, did I just call you Miss Clark June? Sorry. Just what we see in terms of the public markets and what specifically we can do there. So I think what we need to see more of is what the transition looks like. So there's sort of 3 steps: where we are now, where we want to get to, and what we're doing in the middle. So what I think we need to do in September, and I think these are kind of a series of information requests, is what a work plan for a more rapid transition looks like, and really, and how we do that thoughtfully. And I think in order to do that, really what we're looking at is what it's going to cost and what are the risks. So energy is having a banner year. We're seeing 120 degrees temperatures in India. The only way they can account for the things they need in their country is to produce and export more coal. And so there are so many tensions, but I think a much better picture of the risks and the costs, I think, are a really important part of that. And I completely agree to you that it's not just about fossil fuels. I do think a better understanding of the transitions of the sectors we're talking about, including investments the fossil fuel companies are making and others, so a way to really judge those, especially in our public portfolio. And kind of over the long term, how it's performed vis-a-vis a regular fund. So the other thing I'm going to take a little bit of issue with as we look at this is how we're determining risk. I think it's maybe there's 2 ways to do it. Is tracking error a little too simplistic? So obviously none of us can predict the future, and that is the challenge, and that's sort of the question for the board. How much risk are we willing to take for our members? And I do think the team has gone as far as you can within some very strong parameters that we've given you, the 7%, the benchmarks. So now the question is, what can you prepare? And I look to our colleagues at Makita as well. What can you prepare as a risk analysis? How much loss and how much tolerance do we have to really make this transition? And so that's sort of some of the pieces I think will be really important for September. I do think public equities are able to do a lot more of this maybe than we've seen, I think at lower cost. I think 5 years, 3 years, 2 years ago, we talked about sort of the change as an active investment. I in fact now think we have this incredibly skilled team and can do it without any type of active investment. And I think we're seeing our colleagues do that, especially because this transition has become so real. And so I think so if we look at costs, look at risks, look at more than just tracking error, and see now that we have so much data about these transition indexes, how we can get there faster, then you have some very clear work in the public markets where so much of our investments are, as we're sort of looking at and making some pretty remarkable investments through our SIS team. And I think Ms. Jenkinson has some to add on that. But does that make sort of sense as a way? And I think as a board, it would be helpful to have Makita look at this, because I do think that in order for you to go a little bit further, perhaps, and I think the world is warming potentially faster than we had imagined, any of us, we need to understand those very precise trade-offs, not kind of anecdotally, but in a much more precise way in order to give more significant direction. So I think, Madam Chair, I don't know if that's sort of a helpful frame, and I don't know if anyone on the team has thoughts on what that could potentially look like.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I assume Steve's writing notes for information items, but Chris, did you want to chime in?
We're actually in very tight alignment and agreement with you, Gail. And we, from an investment standpoint, we use tracking error as a technical measure of risk, but you're right. In a nutshell, and I've said this to the board at offsites, we have historically been very passive. We have followed the markets, but you are going to have to make active decisions, which in a nutshell means you're predicting the future. The last 2 years and Russia, Ukraine have shown us anything. Predicting the future is very difficult. I can use the old Yogi Berra, predictions are difficult, especially ones about the future. But we're going to have to come to you I can tell you our investment team is focused, but is not of one mind about what's going to come. And we're not comfortable trying to extend that prediction about how companies and how countries will react. Right now, I had a talk with Mark Carney, Special Envoy to the United Nations, 2 days ago, one-on-one, and he's really focused. It's business that is going to have to lead this transition. And I agree, it's a transition, not a race, but a huge global transition. And he hopes governments will follow. Normally, it's the other way around. So that's going to put challenges on us to push companies to be faster and farther. And it's going to put you in a tough place. We'll have tools, I think, to judge whether companies are moving fast enough, but it's going to be a judgment. And how much do you want to make an active decision about whether a company is moving far enough, fast enough, or not? And I just can't emphasize, the life around us has to dramatically change just in the next 10 years.
May I,
Yeah,
Madam
go,
Chair?
please.
So I agree. Mr. Ailman, I would just make two other points. So we're looking at this over the long term. So one, I don't know that necessarily we are being asked to predict the future. We're being asked to see this over a long-term horizon. I do think there's a little nuance there that's really important. And I do think that I don't know anymore who leads this transition, because I think no matter what we're saying about our markets, we're in a transition, and I think it's important just to be mindful of that. So I think it is going to have to be kind of a coordinated group effort. So I think even understanding all of the different companies who we never thought would be a part of this transition. I think the work our team did on Exxon, for example, they're making other investments to sort of bring us into the transition. I think we're seeing it in the transportation sector. So I think the traditional way we've viewed the markets in terms of making any change means you're predicting something there's a little bit of a nuance without any mandates and without an instant sale that really is just sort of, it means it'll just be immediately bought up, especially given where we are with the energy sector. Like, we would be negative if we were out of energy right now. But the idea of the long term and making a commitment to move forward and the signal of this transition, I think, is how we do it without sort of, an unreasonable mandate or something that we can't implement. But I do think when we see it over the long term, it's a little bit different than the immediate decisions businesses are making. So I would sort of ask Mr. Carney that question, right? Like, governments are in this for the long term. Businesses have to make short-term returns. So how do we sort of expand that horizon and make sure we're looking at it that way? I don't know if that resonates at all. I think this is difficult, but I think this is the type of information that the board needs. And then just in terms of, I'm going to draw a distinction between an active decision of the board, but our ability to manage the markets. If we were to make this active decision, our team, it's not an active investment, because our team can still manage our passive markets with some changes. So we've talked a lot about sort of active investments and how much those cost versus an active decision. So I don't know if that makes sense as a distinction, but I think, I guess we have the capacity to do some of this internally, and that's another question, Mr. McCourt, to Makita.
Yeah.
No, to you first, Mr. Chan, but I mean to Makita in terms of our
I was just going to
capacity.
say, what you are saying, I think Chris opened up, we're in very tight alignment. In fact, as we bring forward the scenarios and analysis in September, I think you'll see that. And I think what you're referring to, Gail, is that this is a broader discussion that also needs to happen as part of the strategic asset allocation, which I think would be very, very appropriate. But I know it's been fun to dialogue with you over the last 3 years, because so much has changed. And what we had talked about doing 3 years ago, I think we're on the cusp of now being able to do it, because measurement's gotten better. We've got the data. And of course, you referenced in global equities, we've got a great team to be able to optimize this. So I think, without saying what we're going to do exactly, I think in September it'll be very interesting to have that dialogue.
Thank you, sir.
Could I just add on as well? I think the points I'm hearing you say as well is something we see reflected in what's happening in the market and also in the investment branch as we discuss this internally, is it's understanding that if we have these tracks of what can we do within the portfolio and how can we measure that through the, the framework of how much risk, what are the implications on return, what are the implications on the impact on carbon emissions, that's an entirely different framework for thinking about how to track and understand and look at the portfolio. And I think we've made great progress in really thinking about that. And that's what we'll be bringing back to you in September. We have to see and we have to hope that the market continues to evolve on the other side as well around how are companies and the broader markets and how are policies. We have a sort of a system under the UN UN financial sort of reporting on climate change to allow companies to report on a regular basis how they're meeting their emissions reductions targets. That framework exists. We're just starting to see that happen with companies around how are companies transitioning in line with their commitments. And so we have now got an infrastructure starting to evolve that will allow us to track the progress that we're seeing in the broader world. It's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult because this is still very, very nascent, but I'm confident that we're going to have a lot more tools at our disposal to allow us to be tracking this. And that's how we sort of need to pivot and understand how we're going to manage both our engagement efforts and how we see that, and also how we think about our portfolio efforts. So from a vote of sort of positivity, even though there's a long way to go, I see this infrastructure starting to develop. That's what we're adopting as we make smart decisions.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Good. But I think those are good. Go ahead, Steve.
Steve McCourt, Makita, just impartial response to Ms. Miller's comments and also the investment teams. First, want to highlight, I'm pleased that both the investment team and Ms. Miller highlighted the importance of investment policy in this transition, because as was noted, that will have to be addressed with any sort of reasonable transition plan with an investment portfolio. And as it relates to active decisions, wholeheartedly agree that, whether they are active decisions of a board or a staff in implementing a board's policy, we would certainly advocate for active decisions to be very data-driven. So I think the key to doing this in the lowest risk way will be measurement, review, scrutiny, analysis, and making sure that decisions at every level of the decision process are made with as much good information as possible.
Thanks, Steve. Other comments? Those are all good points, Gail, and I think I was looking at you. There's two Steves in alignment, so Steve, the attorney, our staff, if you can take notes of the information request, because I think we should make sure the September agenda includes some of the information that Ms. Miller raised. Hi, Betty. Good morning. Nice to see you. It says Lynn Paquin, but you're Betty He. So, Betty, we'll go to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First, thank you to the SYS team for just the tremendous progress in such a systematic way, and just really pleased to see what has happened since this board took the pledge. To Ms. Miller's point, I assume that we are also going to be seeing adjustments to our active risk budget as well, and so I assume that will all be coming back to us as well, just for review.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in. I think that we've been thinking about it in two ways, right? The active decision of the board, and the capacity for us on a strategic asset allocation level to make shifts, and then staff's, just taking global equity as an example, we currently have 0 to 50 basis points of tracking error. That's really, really tight. So the capacity for increasing that risk budget versus making a strategic decision at a board level, we have to consider those two elements. And I think just kind of branching off of what Ms. Miller said, the strategic decision at the board level might be a better way for us to guide this decision and recommendation towards, but we'll show both options.
Okay. Good, thank you. And then I was curious how, Kirsty, you and your team would be maintaining your current engagement strategy if we decided not to invest in some companies. I guess, just thinking about what the impact on carbon reduction in the markets as a whole would be, but, and then at what point would the decisions be made or considered on a, or move from a company level to kind of more of a sector level? I mean, what are the considerations around that?
Thank you, and sorry, I should say I'm Kirsty Jenkinson, the Director of Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies. I didn't introduce myself before, so forgive me. Yes, I'm Controller Yee. I think clearly what we laid out in the sort of the escalation steps that we showed is something that we've been, moving towards for a number of years, but we recognise that there will come a point where we need a clearer understanding of where companies have not met our expectations. What are the outcomes? What are the consequences? And what are the sort of like the next steps that we take? We've tried to sort of lay that out as a path for you in the next couple of years to start entertaining this discussion around what happens. We would look to you as a board for the direction on what your expectation is and how we would manage that. We firmly believe, as you know, that, again, back to my earlier comments, this needs to be fluid, it needs to be iterative, because whether a company might not meet our expectations in 2025, by 2026 or 2027, it might. So again, it brings back Chris's point of active decision-making around these issues. This is not going to be something that is stagnant. This is a very sort of evolving area. And so how we are nimble to understand how companies are moving and how they are changing is going to have to be something that we embed across all of our engagement strategies and our investment decision making. This isn't a kind of like, you take a decision in 2023 and that stays forevermore. There has to be a way to iterate and understand how the evolution continues. I think that's going to be really important.
Good. And then I did want to explore understanding the disclosure limitations and just kind of the whole double counting aspects of Scope 3 data. Are we at a point of actually being able to use or maybe to look at including Scope 3 data as maybe an incentive to try to get companies to, kind of step up a bit?
Let me try to take that. I think there's still a lot of conversation, sort of uncertainty about how meaningful Scope 3 emissions are, though I would say that more companies are starting to disclose it. Certainly more investors are starting to ask for it. And I think how data service providers are analyzing Scope 3 emissions in terms of, risks, et cetera, are improving. To the point where I suspect shortly they will be sort of part of the standard measurement. Now it's just being Scope 1 and 2. I think certainly we can choose to make our expectations to be that the companies make a reasonable effort to disclose Scope 3. I would say at this point it may not be meaningful, but certainly something that, as we pointed out, we continue to look at it and may decide in the near future that it is something we should ask of companies.
And just to be clear, sorry, we are very much, the SEC, as many people I think know, have got a consultation out on climate risk disclosure, and our team are busy sort of working on how do we frame our response to that. And one of them is that we hope that they will be able to, set a standard that includes Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And we need that kind of clear data from every single company. I have very strong concerns that sort of will be pushed back because of where we, are in terms of the political challenges that the SEC is going to face in getting any rule passed. But I think we have to continue to push for it because we need that clarity as investors. And if the SEC knows that it's helping us in investment decision making, that is going to help hopefully make that clear argument.
How prepared are we to actually include Scope 3 just based on what we have in our own report of our footprint?
We are provided Scope 3 emissions data through the MSCI platform that we use. We've just chosen to not include that just because of the uncertainty. It was brought up maybe to help sort of explain what Scope 3 emissions are.
You to do that. Brian.
Scope 1, direct, you burn fossil fuels. Scope 2 is generally electricity, energy consumption. Scope 3 is kind of everything else. It's all the carbon that's embedded upstream, the supply chain that you bring in. It's the carbon that's downstream that when people use your product. And so that's where the conversations come in terms of the double counting, the triple counting, and how you really properly account for carbon generally when you're looking at, okay, well, you counted for it when it was emitted, you counted for it when the energy was consumed, and now you're counting for it again when somebody else. So that's sort of where the debate goes in. But we are provided that data. It's just a matter of whether we think we have the confidence that it's accurate enough, it correctly reflects carbon emissions, and we want to use that in terms of how we analyze companies for engagement purposes or perhaps other investment decisions.
Okay. And I was thinking of the more in line of reports that we put out that might be TCFD aligned to where we can begin just to have some of that data. Maybe it gets better refined over time, but I do feel like we have a little bit of a responsibility to kind of lead that charge at understanding the limitations of that data.
Yes.
Okay.
I understand where you're coming from. You're saying specifically in how we report out about our activities. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Betty. Any other questions? Oh, that's fine. Or if you have other comments, feel free. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for this work, right?
If you just, I can get your mic going if you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Got it.
There you go. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. I really want to reiterate the thanks and the appreciation for the extreme real leadership that we've taken in this and support for the multi-pronged, data-based, partner-oriented approach and flexible as the world around us evolves and the tools that really move the needle continue to present themselves, and also taking the near-term as well as the long-term approach. And one of the questions I was going to ask, but Controller Yee, again, beat me to the punch on it. But I just want to add my support as well as we think about the active risk budget, to really think innovatively, thoughtfully about the real, we have real knowledge in this area, and as we think about the collaborative model, as we think about the risk budget and underpinned, by data and confidence, are there ways, there may or may not be, but are there ways that we can continue to think about that as we move forward to September and into next year, the asset allocation and beyond? Thank you.
Great. Any other members of the committee? Questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Chris. I actually really, and team, I appreciate what you're saying too about how much the world is changing. I do think, your early comments about like electric vehicles, I do think one of the things we don't talk about as much is the issue around, it's not just about supply, but it's about demand. So we were talking about businesses, but I also just think businesses and consumers, right? I mean, that's how businesses work, is people buy stuff from companies. And I know I'm seeing so much changing just in my neighborhood, and consumers are wanting to buy and purchase things that are better for the environment, they're better for animals, they're better for, so I think that issue around the demand piece isn't talked about enough, and I think that's a big part of this conversation. I also think one of the things, and I align a lot of what Gail had to say earlier about the costs and the risks. I think that I think what I hear from the public when I interact with our members is just wanting to see more data, wanting to see more numbers, and trying to understand. I think I get questions a lot around, how much CO2 is in the CalSTRS portfolio. I know those are complicated questions, and I know for us as teachers, we tend to want to have things black and white and really easy to understand. But I do wonder if, as we're kind of on this journey together, if there are ways that we can communicate simply and clearly about just some metrics so that as members go out and talk to other members, that they have some tools to be able to say, again, with the caveat that it's challenging the private markets, I get that, but in the public markets in particular, how are we making that transition, and what is our exposure, our CO2 emission exposure, and can we do that? I don't know if that's a question to me. Can we provide that to members? I also think that because I do think that we live in California where there's wildfires, there's floods. Again, we all see it when we walk out the door. There's so much going on in our world right now in terms of the environment that we have to be listening to that and saying that's going to impact real estate, that's going to impact businesses. And as good stewards, we need to kind of address that and respond to that and be active and not just wait for the market to tell us what to do. So I appreciate, I think the board is really clear to say we want CalSTRS to lead in partnership with businesses in terms of making this transition. And I also agree that, we need to move as fast as is prudent, right? So we're seeing, things out of BlackRock and places making, so again, the 2030, 75%, those kinds of numbers. And I'm not saying we should be like BlackRock, but BlackRock has a lot more assets than we do. And so if they can do it, are there ways that we can do it in our CalSTRS way? So again, we need to be prudent and thoughtful, but are there ways that we can both communicate to our members more clearly about how we are moving the transition? Because I really appreciate the write-up, and I think it's helpful for people to see some of these metrics. And I'm guessing in September, we might have a little bit more information to share. And I get we're the largest teacher pension fund in the world, and we have, we're a global investor. But if there are ways and strategies, and I know we have comms in the room too, of being able to kind of along the way, even in this conversation today, to go out from the public today and say, here's what we're doing on the transition, and this is how we're actually moving money, but we're also moving our influence with people. And I think those are two really important strategies that we've been using. So, I'm looking forward to the conversation in September. I appreciate Ms. Miller's request for more information in that report. And with that, are there any other comments or questions from you? Does that seem doable, Scott?
Well, I think that several things resonated. We've been building to this point how to measure carbon emissions within our public portfolio, and I think that was mentioned. Now that we've had experience, our global equity team, in running some of these strategies as well, roughly 8 billion or so. So we've been building and evolving, and I think we'll be able to bring those scenarios and numbers and the consideration of risk along many dimensions, not only the tracking error and volatility, but as we think about the expected opportunities in investing in net zero strategies, as we think about the carbon emissions reductions in our portfolio as well, which we've been holding up as a risk that we're analyzing. So all those things I think we're going to be able to bring together, hopefully by September. I'm pretty sure we can. But we've worked to that point where we can provide some of that analysis and numbers to the degree that it'll work its way into the investment strategies where we'll compare the investment strategies. Anywhere from divestment and a holistic investment strategy and anything in between, because we've developed that framework. So thinking about BlackRock, again, we'll be working with the board to try to develop an aspirational target by 2030, and then a framework so that we can look through this lens of risk and answer the question, how does that risk relate to our ability to meet our funded status? How does this relate to our expected returns as well? So.
Yeah. No, I think the thing we don't talk about enough in this conversation is around, it's the risk to the portfolio in terms of, we have a 7%, target that we're trying to reach for our members, and we need to make sure that we meet that target. And given what just happened with the Fed yesterday, with increasing interest and inflation, and again, we don't know what the future is going to hold, so we need to hold up that obligation to our members. But this is what we do. We measure risk and reward, if you will. And so I appreciate the conversation. With that, I don't see any other members from the committee, so thank you. Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks, Brian, Scott, Steve McCourt, Chris.
You want to take public comment?
Yeah. Yep. So Samantha, I know we have some public comment from item 5.
Yeah, so we have 5 speakers for item 5, so they'll get 2 minutes each per the 10-minute comment period. Okay, so our first speaker will be Kevin.
Good morning. Is it on? Okay, good morning, CalSTRS board members. My name is Kevin Welch. I'm the chair of the California Teachers Association Retirement Committee. Thank you for allowing me to speak. We appreciate this item's update regarding CalSTRS net zero strategy, and we are enthusiastic about the continued work to transition to net zero and expanding the low carbon transition pathway to include net zero emission for the net zero emission pledge. It is essential that we take concrete goals and measurable steps towards ensuring that the CalSTRS investment portfolio includes sound and responsible long-term investment strategies that address and respond to the shifts towards a greener, more sustainable world economy. As companies and governments around the world are prioritizing climate responsibility, our goal is to ensure that the investment decisions across portfolios give CalSTRS the competitive market advantage to maximize returns, as well as to provide our members that the dependable retirement that they can count on. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Our next speaker will be Doug.
I should have spoken earlier because I had 3 minutes and I have a 3-minute talk, so I'll talk fast. So I'm Doug Orr. I'm the chair of the California Federation of Teachers Retirement Policy Committee. And as you all know, the CFT has taken a position in support of divestment, but also until divestment occurs, we support CalSTRS efforts at corporate engagement on many different fronts. We and CalSTRS recognize that all markets have both a supply side and a demand side. Efforts at divestment focus only on one side of the market, and focusing only on one side of the market is always ineffective. As long as the United States and the world have a seemingly unquenchable demand for fossil fuels, someone is going to supply those fuels, whether that's Exxon, Chevron, the Saudis, or Russia. Therefore, we support CalSTRS efforts to reduce the demand for fossil fuels, which is a lot of what you've been talking about just now. We applaud all of your efforts to force corporations to reveal their Scope 1, Scope 2, and hopefully Scope 3 emissions. We also applaud your push at the SEC that would also require corporations to do that. And because we can't try to reduce our carbon footprint if we don't know what the carbon footprint is. Consumers who care about climate change cannot reduce their carbon footprint if they don't know what it is. We support CalSTRS investment in alternative energy projects and your efforts to drive changes in global supply chains. But now to the main thing I wanted to say, which is we are also urging CalSTRS to use your influence to try to get the country at the state and federal levels to implement a price on carbon. Because as long as people don't see the cost of what they're buying in terms of the price of carbon, people won't change their behavior. And by a price on carbon, we are not talking about cap and trade, because cap and trade was a thing put forward by corporations so that they could game the system. We're talking about a price on.
Our next speaker will be Paul.
That's a pretty good level. Thank you. My name is Paul Banson. I'm a teaching credential candidate in special education and elementary education at Cal State Stanislaus. And I'm also speaking here in my individual capacity, but I'm a member of the Student California Teachers Association, which is the aspiring educators affiliate of CTA and the state affiliate of the NEA Aspiring Educators Program. So I'd just like to express my gratitude to the Teachers Retirement Board for approving the sustainable investments and stewardship strategies. Grateful for the Green Team for all your work on the Net Zero Pledge and the materials that we've seen here today. So the concern that I'd really like to share today in terms of what I saw in the pledge and the materials provided, put together for this meeting by the Green Team is that to me, the pledge lacks a powerful strategy to achieve its stated goals, and that is fossil fuel divestment. As we saw in that report, new investments are better positioned for the transition to low carbon economy. The Rhodium Group found that that CalSTR's real estate holdings are at risk due to the climate, big time. The UN IPCC says that these changes need to come in the next, changes need to come in the next 10 years. We don't have till 2050. And divestment, because fossil fuel investments have already met, in my opinion, the criteria of divestment, this needs to be part of the consequences that we're leveraging to achieve the goals. And thank you very much.
Samantha, do we have any other speakers?
I'm sorry, I think I pressed the wrong button.
It's okay.
Thank you for your comment, and our next speaker will be Goli.
Hello, my name is Dr. Glail Saba, and I've taught nutrition and science part-time at Fruit Ridge Elementary and the Language Academy of Sacramento for over 15 years. I'm also a family physician concerned about the health of our students and our fellow Californians. I applaud your efforts to reach net zero goals. However, by 2050 would be too late, because this goal is not based on the latest science. As someone else mentioned, the IPCC's latest report from April 4th states, quote, "Without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is beyond reach. Morally, you must not stand by while your portfolio oil companies such as Total and Canuck invest in new oil and gas projects such as the East Africa crude oil pipeline that Lynn described. Furthermore, the world's carbon budget will not allow new fossil fuel projects if we are to have a livable future for our teachers and our students. This means you must follow the lead of UC Davis pensions managers who've recently divested from fossil fuels due to much higher financial gains coming from investing in renewable technologies. In the last 8 years, funds that excluded fossil fuels have outperformed those that still invest in them. Over 1,300 schools, including Harvard University institutional investors and pension funds such as New York State's Common Retirement Fund, have made it clear that investing in fossil fuels is financially and morally unacceptable. This means following the lead of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, the City and County of Sacramento, which have recently declared climate emergencies and pushed their carbon zero dates from 2045 to 2030. This means that if we don't stop emissions and draw down already emitted carbon in 10 years, the tipping points will lead to irreversible climate catastrophe.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Lynn.
Thank you. Lynn Nidler from Fossil Free California. I am dismayed that you are pondering reaching net zero by 2050. Let me start where I live in Davis, 20 minutes across the causeway from this building. You probably picture a university town with lots of intellectual activity. I can hop on my bike and in 10 minutes, I'm pedaling along county roads between farms, raising seasonal crops that vary from corn, wheat, row vegetables, and whole fields of tomatoes. We also have orchards of fruit trees and walnuts and almonds. Part of our academic university focuses on crops and food production, now increasingly on climate change and its impacts. Yolo and surrounding counties grow perhaps 40% of the vegetables, 30% of the fruit for our nation, right where I live. And I'm hearing disturbing things from local farmers lately. I think I'll do this. Better, huh? One farmer who lives in my same Village Homes solar development is concerned he won't have enough water allocation for year-round crops this year. Almond farmers 50 miles up I-5 toward my sister already tore out their almond trees as they lost their water rights for next year. One of the K-Pay farmers with weekly veggie box subscriptions decided to cancel his summer boxes of veggies for next year due to lack of water. Our City of Davis officials assured us that we have nothing to fear. We sit on aquifers of water until they discovered that those very wells that have never failed before are dry. Just when will Governor Newsom declare the drought we have already entered and which is predicted to last this decade, possibly longer? Researchers have estimated that 42% of the drought's severity is attributable to human-caused climate change.
Thank you for your comment. That is the conclusion of the public comment for item 3.
Thank you, Lynn, and the public speakers, and thank you, Samantha, for helping us with that. With that, we're going to move on to item 4. So we'll bring up Lachey, and we're going to talk about diversity and June. Kim? The Dodgers did pretty good this week, June. So we're gonna, we have, correct me if I'm wrong, but Lachey, we have 2 parts to this. 4A, the diversity and management of investments piece is an action item that the board does need to take action on. And then the second part, B, the diversity report and strategic roadmap update is just an information item. Is that accurate? Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Lachey and June.
Good morning, Investment Committee. I'm June Kim, your Director of Global Equity. In the Investments Branch, we have a Diversity Steering Committee. I chair that committee, so I am sitting before you on this item in that capacity. I'm joined this morning by Lachey Badalita, who is the Diversity Investment Officer that was hired into the Investments Branch just over a year ago. So thank you, Chair Hendricks. We do have a 2-part item. Part A is action, and we need the board's direction related to Assembly Bill 890, and then B is information. Just to level set, because it's been a while since we've talked about this, we have new board members. This is the investment branch definition of diversity that was created over the past couple years. And the point to make here is that we've been at diversity for a very long time. It precedes AB 890. We have been proponents and we've been supporters of diversity efforts for 30 years, and our efforts will continue even after AB 890 sunsets. I'm going to hand it over to Lachey to go over the action item with you.
Great. Thank you, June, and good morning, committee members. California Assembly Bill 890 requires CalSTRS to deliver an annual report to legislation based on information that we've contracted with emerging managers and diverse managers that we've contracted as of January 1st of 2022. Our first report to the legislature is no later than March of 2023. Thank you. As such, we are here today seeking the board's approval of 3 proposed definitions in order to prepare that report. The first definition is emerging manager, second is diverse manager, and last is the objective regarding participation of these managers. The proposed definitions were developed with the input of internal leadership as well as industry experts such as peer institutional investors and consultants. So we'll start with the objective first that we're seeking approval for. And it reads as follows on page 5 of the 4A memo. Consistent with its fiduciary duties, CalSTRS will pursue and invest emerging and diverse managers that generate performance that is aligned with the risk and return objectives of the applicable CalSTRS asset class. Okay, 7, thank you. So the next 2 terms that we're seeking your approval for are emerging manager and diverse manager. And to level set, on this slide is a comparison of the 2. We have purposely defined these terms as not synonymous, so therefore they're not interchangeable terms. Emerging manager will vary across the asset classes, while the diverse manager definition will be uniformed across all asset classes. However, there may be some managers who identify as both, as indicated with the arrow on the slide.
So speaking to emerging manager, which will continue to be based on minimum qualifications for reasons related to the nature of public markets versus private market characteristics. There are 5 here. The qualifications address assets under management, fund life cycle, ownership, legal structure, and other factors including track record of that fund. More details of each of the minimum qualifications for each asset class is listed on slide 9 of this PowerPoint deck.
The second definition we seek your approval on today is the definition of diverse manager, and this is consistent across all asset classes. We had several discussions with the asset class directors and Chris and Scott, and we completely recognize and understand there are many factors that define diversity. In order to implement this reporting requirement, we have narrowed in on 3 characteristics, which is gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. Managers are welcome to provide more statistics if they're willing to, but we feel that focusing on these 3 makes this a very feasible implementation approach for this reporting that will go to the legislature and will become a public record. And so the diverse manager definition will depend on company ownership. If it's 25% to 49% owned, we'll define it as substantially diverse. Anything 50% or more would be defined as majority diverse. But again, if the managers, which we will survey, decide to provide more details, more diverse categories, it will certainly be counted, and we will report on that as well. With that, we're going to open it up to any questions that the board may have. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, June. So this is again for the 4A item. Questions from board members? Blake.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, June and Lachey, for the presentation. Just, I guess, two questions. First off, I commend you all for your work on this. I remember we had our briefing last weekend. AB 890 actually complements a lot of the work you guys have already been doing prior to this becoming law. So with that said, as we know, back in April, the board diversity law was deemed unconstitutional. In the event that this becomes unconstitutional, would you guys still continue with this plan?
Is that a legal question?
Yeah, so maybe better for Brian.
June's looking at the lawyers
Right.
here.
Right.
It's a good question.
That's not surprising me, though. I think there is a major part of the answer that's not legal. So if we look at the court's decision in 979, it really was about counting numbers, and that's what they found unconstitutional. So the board here is supposed to adopt a policy and the goals. So again, if it's not about counting numbers, and by numbers I really mean demographics, which would violate Prop 209 likely. So I think if it's a thoughtful approach, even if the statute was not there, I think you could still continue, because it is the type of work that historically this board and the investment staff have done. I think this is just more of a concrete effort. So we would certainly assist in trying to make sure we don't step over that line. So there could be nothing, in the policy that really defined numbers, if you will, like numbers of any particular group. But I think we could get there, because as I said, you've been doing this for years. This is just, the nice part is you get to set the policy under the statute. So I think that this is a little bit different.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Blake.
Thank you, Brian. And then one more question, at least the action item. Assume we approve it. What's the timeline for implementation?
Sure. So the bill actually went in effect October of 2021. So we've created an implementation team. We've been working towards the production of the report. We are anticipating that, because the report is actually due to legislate in March of 2023, we are making strides in that regard. Upon your approval of these definitions, we will then set forth a DEI manager survey, where, as we mentioned, the managers in our portfolio will self-identify as either emerging manager, diverse manager, or both.
Thank you. I commend you all for your work.
Thanks, Blake. Karen.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the report. And I guess one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, usually in a dictionary form, there's a definition. And usually in that dictionary form, there's no charts or anything like that. So how do we plan to put this definition in a form that's meets the requirements of the law?
Sure. So the emerging manager definition is actually, it's not, we actually do have this definition existing because we have emerging manager programs across the various asset classes that we have. And so there's some differences. I think that this chart kind of illustrates the difference of minimum qualifications. So we thought that depicting it via a table would be more visibly pleasing. And there are some similarities, as you can see. For example, the ownership, in some cases, it's maximum 50% across the board, as well as the legal structure as well. But the main differences are the AUM and perhaps the life cycle, but that's, again, in the nature of the private markets versus the public market characteristics.
Well, what we're talking about right now is the diversity definition, right? That's what the action item.
This is for the emerging manager definition.
Right, this chart's for emerging managers, not diversity.
Right. I'm not looking at that.
So it might help, Karen,
I guess I'm not saying this correctly, you know?
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I think I got you on this one, because I think you're looking for, emerging manager, and then like a line.
Right,
of,
like
this
we
is what
have
that
in our risk policy or our.
So thinking about a simple, like, one sentence definition that's in writing versus a bar graph or something visual, but more just.
But I know that the definition for diverse manager is across all asset classes. So that's pretty easy to do, but it's still not in a form where it looks like a dictionary.
The diverse definition is not either?
No.
Where it's based on ownership and these percent ownership?
To me, no.
What if I summarize it as, for the diverse manager definition, it's based on firm ownership on the 3 criteria: gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and if the ownership is within 25 to 49%. It's not a succinct one sentence, but it can be put in.
Right. But I mean, as far as what AB 890 wants it to be, does it meet those requirements?
AB 890 requires the board to decide what those definitions are. So if you decide this is it, yes, it meets those requirements. But again, I will defer to legal to.
No, I think you got this. I'm here to help, but I think you got this.
Sorry to beat it up.
It's at the board. It's good, Karen, because I think we all have different learning styles. We process this information differently, so it's a good point that, and we wanted to make it clear. I think really what I see with the staff write-up is trying to sort of align the work that we've already been doing in this space on diversity and emerging managers and align it with the legislation. I think that's what I see us doing with this action item.
To get to Karen's point, we intentionally put it as 2 tiers just to appease to private market managers and private market managers.
Okay, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
June, did you guys?
It's the other one that's kind of confused, but we're not doing that right now, so,
Then we'd say that it's based on assets under management and, the criteria are the same, but those criteria will differ across public markets and private markets. That's how I would summarize it.
Okay.
And we would explain that when we submit the report to the legislature.
Okay.
So.
All right, thank you.
No problem, Karen.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
It's good. It's always good to look at things a little differently. Any other members of the committee wanting to chime in? I know I've had conversations with faculty about, language we use with diversity, and I wondered if your task force, your team talked a little bit about using language around like ethnic minority groups versus like BIPOC, or did you guys talk about that? Just because like in certain parts of Los Angeles, what is considered a minority are actually a majority population. So has that come up in your conversations? It doesn't relate to AB.
Well, I would say we didn't go down into that narrow, but we did recognize we have managers across the globe. And so that opens the question, what's diverse here versus what's diverse in Asia or Europe? And Chris has mentioned that before too. But again, I think that the way that we do this survey, the managers will be able to provide their explanation. So if they have that comment to share, they will share that with us. I'm certain that they will share that with us. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I just want to add the ethnic minority group is sort of defined by the U.S. Census as well. So that gives you a reference point to make it more official.
That helps to have it always tied to something, and I would imagine that's probably going to change at some point just because the world is changing, the populations are changing, but that's helpful to kind of have a connection to why we use that language. So thank you for that, Lachey. I don't see any other members of the committee with questions. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Not so much a question, just so the committee's aware. When you look at our total portfolio, half of it's managed in-house. And we're not part of this measurement, but I think you know we have a very diverse team. You own it, so it's a trust fund, but there's a good chunk of our managers who are publicly traded companies, so they won't fit in this definition because they're public stock or mutual companies. And we're large, so we tend to do business with those large firms. So when we go to measure this, you're going to be getting a subset of our active managers. A lot of them are private, so that's where the ownership will come into play. But what we're seeing is that accumulation where managers buy managers. So we'll have to find some way in the future to be able to push those large publicly traded firms, because we want them to have a DE&I program and then measure. You know, everybody will check that box now, but the question is, are they really sincere in moving it forward? So this is our first step, but I think we'll have to have additional steps along the way.
Thanks, Chris. So it is an action item for 4A, and the recommendation is on page 5 of item 4A to recommend the definition for emerging manager, the definition for diverse manager, and the objective. Ken?
Just wanted to point out in terms of, I guess, the diverse manager definitions. So I see that it has LGBT community, but I was wondering if we can add a plus to that. Add a plus to after LGBTQ plus. Right.
Great. Good catch. Thank you, Ken.
Actually, it was
And
Karen that catched it.
Karen, Ken,
Karen.
the KK, the Karen and Ken. Thank you. So staff will make that edit. So with that, I would entertain. Okay, it's been moved by Jennifer and seconded by Ken. Do we need to do a roll call, I believe, Steve, correct, for this?
No, we don't.
Oh, we don't? We were doing roll call yesterday. No?
I think that was a slight misunderstanding.
I
We're only
see.
doing roll call in the Zoom environment. We are back to.
Oh, we're back.
where we
Well, so
were
then
before.
yesterday, we just,
Yes.
okay.
Only
Well, that's
investment
okay.
decisions have to have roll call.
Okay, so all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? We're done. Okay, we're making the transition back to live. Whew. Great, so that was approved. So let's move on to 4B, which is an information item.
If you can pull the slides up again, please. We just had a couple more for 4B. The annual diversity progress report was published a couple weeks ago. And so for this item, Lachey will provide some highlights from that report. We're very proud of the statistics that it shares. And we do have a couple slides for you. Thank you.
Great. So as June mentioned, we released our 8th annual diversity report, which is compartmentalized into 3 pillars: internal investments branch, portfolio company engagement, as well as portfolio management. And so in 2021, we hosted several events that promoted diversity, equity, and inclusion. For example, our Beyond Talk was attended by more than 100 attendees. We also collaborated with a working group to develop the CFA Institute DEI code and published a letter of support as it sets DEI standards of implementation and reporting within the investment industry. The code has 6 principles that addresses talent management, leadership, influence, and measurement in regards to DEI. And today we are happy to announce that as of May 1st, CalSTRS has become an official signatory of the CEFA DEI code, where we will provide regular reporting on our progress of these 6 principles. This year, in 2021, as of December, we also want to continue to track and monitor our diversity composition of our staff. And so in 2021, 45% of our total staff self-identified as female, and 50% of our staff self-identified as ethnically diverse. We also continue to promote gender diversity on corporate boards through our involvement in the 30% Coalition. In 2021, we engaged 250 companies, where 51% out of that effort were appointed women to their boards. Also, I want to give an update on our strategic roadmap that we introduced last year of July. The strategic roadmap serves as a guide to where the staff will then set forth its next 1-year, 3-year, and 5-year DEI-related initiatives in order to continue to embrace and deepen impact of diversity in our portfolio. The roadmap consists of 4 core objectives: clarity, priorities, relevance, and implementation. And as of today, we have completed core objectives, clarity, and priorities. From the core objective, clarity and priorities, I just want to point out some of the things, some of the great effort that the team has to show our leadership in DEI. We have integrated diversity in our investment policies. We show leadership and collaborations on standards in regards to DEI, including we have an internal diversity steering committee that is chaired by June Kim. We also have a broad total fund and asset class activity, including our emerging manager programs that have certain minimum qualifications for managers to participate in the program. And lastly, as I mentioned, we every year voluntarily publish an annual progress report and all the great work that the team has done throughout the year. And with that, I will open this item for questions, comments. Thank you.
Betty.
Thank you for the report. I know it's not mandated by the AB 890 report to the legislature, but I really, really hope that we'll include this report as part of the report to the legislature. And I would ask that that be an action.
Yeah.
Yes, we intend to continue providing this volunteer report, and the AB 890 will just be sort of a complement to what we're already reporting.
Great. No, really excellent work. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Betty. Any others? Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Lachey. Thanks, June. Great. All right. We are going to move to item 5, which is, I should ask, is there any statements from the public, Samantha, on item 4? I will take that as a no. Item 5, Scott, we're going to get, this is an information item on the collaborative model and opportunities portfolio. To you, Scott.
Great. Scott Chan, Deputy CIO, and I'm excited to present the next phase of our collaborative model 2.0. Jonathan, can you move one slide forward, or wait, here we go, sorry. Again, the Zoom format. For those that are new to the board, I just want to level set. Collaborative model is our efforts to bring more of our assets internal, to save on costs and fees, to boost our returns, and to control our risks in a better framework. Over the last 4 years, we've saved over $780 million in relationship to the collaborative model, and Chris has aims for our division to save an additional $300 million per year. Collaborative Model 2.0 is simply moving along that continuum to more complex investments, going from SMAs and co-investments to actually owning businesses on the far end, public to private. 2.0 is about moving more to areas where we're not only saving fees and costs, but we're also sharing in the profits of some of these businesses, and we have a much greater degree of control over risk. So the next step we perceive is to create an opportunities portfolio. Why? Well, I'd like to draw a simple analogy. Think about this graphic. Rain is coming down, maybe 10 gallons of rain is coming down. That rain represents investment opportunities and transactions. How does CalSTRS capture that? Well, we have 8 different buckets, 8 asset classes, and consider that each of these buckets has 1 gallon of capacity. Well, 2 gallons of rain or investment opportunities is spilling through in between the cracks or outside of the buckets. What are we missing? Why would we need to create an opportunities portfolio? There are 2 opportunities. One is scale. So if you think about our 8 asset classes, each of the positions they're sizing is to diversify that asset class. But when you roll that to the total fund level, we could be taking larger positions and still be diversified at a total fund level. And as you know, greater scale begets better negotiation and deals for CalSTRS. The second is what we're calling one fund type of deals. These are transactions that fall in between asset classes, go across asset classes, or essentially go from private to public or public to private, vice versa. A good example to think about is maybe a renewables platform, but with a lot of development risk. So we think about that from that perspective, it might be too risky for our inflation sensitive division, but then the returns are too low for our private equity division. It falls in between, and it's harder for us to process that. When we think about the opportunities portfolio, I want you to think that it's good to be the boss. It's going to be the boss, right, Chris?
You bet.
Just checking. So best opportunity set, best speed, best scale. So in this environment of lower opportunities, how can we expand our opportunity set by having another bucket capture all the in-between types of opportunities? Best speed. We need to streamline and create a structure and a portfolio and a process where we can react quickly, because we're missing these opportunities because we simply don't have the structure to react to it quickly. And the third is scale. Simply scale allows us to capture more economics, allows us to capture more fee savings. So in the diagram you see before you, to a limited extent, we're capturing these opportunities in our innovative strategies portfolio and our CIS new opportunities portfolio. We like what we're doing there. We're going to keep that the same, but it allows us the opportunity to consolidate these and create a new sleeve. But we need to do much more than what we're doing in those 2 portfolios. That's not enough. As you can see, there are many differences. One is transaction size, small versus large. The second is having a long-term or permanent structure, which the proposed operating portfolio is supposed to be, versus a temporary one. As you know, in our innovative strategies, we seed it or innovate it there, and then we move it to an asset class over time. And the third is just one of sourcing. I want us to source across all the asset classes, and I want the best ideas to be coming from every division. And that's happening to a limited extent in the innovative strategies portfolio, but they have a smaller team. So I think it's also particularly important for us as we roll it up. You see that our current allocation for innovative strategies in the CIS new opportunities portfolio is 0 to 2.5%. And I've been working with, in particular, Steve McCourt on diagramming this out, and he's done some analysis of our US peers. He's seen anywhere between 5 and 7.5% in allocations, but Steve probably can talk about that a little bit more. This is something where, again, I think we should include it in our strategic asset allocation study so we can model it out and see how this might look like for CalSTRS over the long term. And finally, I just would say that this will allow us to start on a small scale, to manage risk on a smaller scale, progress, continue to demonstrate, hopefully a successful track record of performance. We have many of these investments already. We have a rich history, but ultimately evolve to become the type of organization in that first slide where we can prosecute and execute on any type of transaction across our portfolio. The goal today really is just have a robust discussion and get some guidance for the board. If you want us to study this, there are several next steps. We haven't talked a lot about risk, but I think we should. Maybe in the Q&A we'll do that because there's a risk that we become too concentrated. How are we going to mitigate that? How are we going to mitigate the execution risk? There's internal governance as well as governance for the board. We'll need to make policy changes and report on how we will manage compliance monitoring and reporting. And of course, we already talked about the asset allocation modeling. So with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Q&A.
Great, Scott. Thanks. So you're just looking, basically, it's an information item with perhaps a little direction from us. Okay. Thanks, Scott. Jennifer.
Thank you. And thank you, Scott and team, for continuing to think innovatively and continuing to think about our edge with risk control. I do want to express, I tend to err towards simplicity. And I'm all for the intent of what we're trying to do in terms of utilizing our scale with appropriate risk control and take advantage of our relationships and access and expertise across asset classes to collaborate and invest in what suits the portfolio, in addition to be poised to take advantage of tactical market-based opportunities or just speed opportunities. So 100% on board with that. The implementation of it, I would just ask, are there ways to do it more simply? And I have some thoughts around that if that's of interest, but are there ways to do it more simply? I'd encourage us to keep a target of 0 at the bottom end, up to a certain amount if we go this route, and to think very carefully about the intent. It sounds as though it's portfolio dampening with some growth. Anyway, as we go forward, think very carefully about the intent, the benchmark, and the risk that we're willing to take and how we're going to measure that and how we're going to ensure that we have compensated risk, if you will, for what we're taking here. And we avoid the uncompensated risk and use our illiquidity wisely, our scale wisely. So anyway, it's input. The objective of what we're trying to do is fantastic. I mean, I think at our size, our scale, and our expertise, we're leaving an intrinsic value on the table if we're not keeping an eye on these and taking advantage of them thoughtfully. But again, I challenge us to ask if there's a more simple way to go about it with all the appropriate risk control.
Great. No, I appreciate your comments. And this is, again, just meant to be a robust discussion. So I'd love to spend some time with you, maybe one-on-one, to talk about some of the ideas you were suggesting, but not bringing forward right at this moment.
Betty.
Thank you. And I'm going to echo Ms. Erden's observations here. I also really applaud the goals that we're trying to achieve. And I guess with respect to just kind of keeping it simple, and you alluded to this, Scott, but I wanted to just hear it again about why the existing innovative strategies portfolio isn't sufficient to kind of get us there.
Yeah, well, I think it's really those 3 areas that we discussed. The first is one of scale.
Yeah.
So necessarily they were designed to be smaller positions, maybe seed position, new innovative types of strategies. And this could capture more mature positions that are very scalable. So and we see a lot of those opportunities. In fact, that could be a larger opportunity for CalSTRS. I think very importantly, Chris and I want, and the directors feel this way as well, a portfolio where we can source it with any division that they're seeing, because we want to leverage our partners in every division. And having, sort of a smaller team in innovation strategies, they are coordinating with the rest of the asset classes, but I think it's different if anybody from any division can bring forward the right kind of best opportunity for this portfolio, any director, for example. So I think that's, and then there's this sense of having a long-term nature, because a lot of what we're doing in the innovative portfolios are meant to be transferred, and we've done this successfully, right? So we created RMS out of that, and so that's working well. But we want permanent or long-term types of opportunities as well that don't necessarily need to be transferred, but could be anywhere from a 0% target to a 5% target per se.
So given that, then, for example, the SIS New Opportunities component of this portfolio would still have the SIS team involved in it. So this is a place where they can come with
back one slide if you can. I think that best answers it. Yeah, we're seeing this as holistic. SIS stays where it is and it keeps doing things. Innovative does new things. And what we're asking you, if you can support the idea of an opportunistic, all three to go together in that common allocation. They're just attacking different teams going after different segments, but yep, they would still be there.
Okay. And then on the issue of benchmarks, so what type of benchmarks would this new asset class have? And are we thinking about multiple ones, one that would apply to scale and one for the one fund investments, or?
I think the good news is that since we already have an innovative strategies portfolio, we could really branch off of that benchmark. And as we model it, talking with Stephen Cord and others, we could model it as one holistic opportunities portfolio, which most likely would mirror total fund returns with some premium on a longer term basis. So we don't need to recreate the wheel. I think we already have a structure in place which we can create around.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Gail.
Thank you. I think this is a really remarkable opportunity, and really appreciate you bringing it forward just in terms of the sort of siloed approach we have that we need to have because that's how asset classes work. So I do think that this can be, we've missed some opportunities, and I actually thought your sort of the diagram of how we've missed those opportunities was really important. I do think to Ms. Erden and the controller's point, just how we, the question that you asked, Mr. Tanit, in terms of how we measure risk, and so how it's measured and how it's counted, and what the criteria we're looking for are, I think is important. So I'm interested in sort of if there's a simpler approach to that, and I'm not sure what that is. But then how, and because this is an opportunity fund, just like the discussion we were having earlier, do we want to, what sort of level of active risk is the board willing to take on this to make sure that we're not leaving opportunities behind in a very growing and changing economy, I think is a really important point. So I'm interested to know what you think about that. I'm interested in Makita's thoughts on that, and where kind of best practices are, and what other pension funds have done in this regard. I mean, this is, and I think the piece I would love to hear a little bit more about is Singapore and the sovereign wealth funds. I mean, the reason they've been so successful is because they've sort of engaged in these much bigger opportunities, and it does make them much more of a partner of choice when we go into these co-investments. And then the third part of this I have, and I know we talk a lot about this, but I do think opportunities like this can really galvanize some of the investment community and some of the team you're looking to bring in terms of a recruitment tool. So risks and measurement, number one. Two, kind of best practices around other sovereign wealth funds around the world. And then three, how you think this can help with recruitment in terms of making the job more fun and interesting, because there'll be so many more co-investment activities.
Okay, great. There's a lot of questions. I'm going to try to hit them, and then we'll turn it over to Steve. But they were all great questions. They were all I think when we talk about risk, I'd like to talk about two levels. One is the risk to become too concentrated. And I actually believe the reverse is happening, because we are diversifying our position sizes within each of the asset classes, right? And so we'll task Geraldine and the risk team to see at what level of position sizes across different types of securities and assets could we get up to, right? And so if we capture that in the right way, to us, it's about taking full advantage and appropriate advantage of our scale, but remaining diversified. If we can do that, then what remains is implementation risk, as we've been talking about in the collaborative model. As we move to more complex types of investments, we need greater resources, processes, risk controls. Are we doing the due diligence correctly selecting the right managers as we go into more complex transactions. Do we have the right infrastructure around our operations? That implementation risk, we've always thought that we can manage and mitigate because we will be going progressively and building out our organization. So that's the execution risk. The other thing I would say about risk is that as we scale our positions, we actually control our risk better because we have more control over what we buy and sell with the managers. And we also have more control over how they conduct their business as well. So I think all of those things are great elements. You also mentioned another type of risk, which is the active risk that we would be taking. To me, again, that's something where we'd look to our strategic asset allocation study. And Steve and I have talked about including it in there to think about, what additional, for example, illiquidity risk we might be taking in this portfolio as well as other risks. So that will be addressed from that perspective. Now, finally, you talked about our peers, and if you looked back at the first slide, I didn't actually get to the optimal structure, but an optimal structure might entail a very simplified way for us to prosecute our opportunities. And it could be, and I know the board is evaluating this with Nikita, how could we simplify, for example, benchmarks to become more flexible? And how could we simplify our policies to the degree that we could be more flexible as well? If we did that, of course, staff would take more ownership of the risk management. So these are complex issues, but I think that optimal structure, this opportunities portfolio allows us to evolve towards that. And again, as a progressive way, we could go two routes. We could continue to increase that opportunities portfolio if we found it, merited it, or we could shift to a more flexible structure in the long term, which would be simpler, but it would take a lot of work around the benchmarking, the policies, and how we think about that. Steve?
Great. Thank you, Steve McCourt. Makita, there's a lot here, and I guess I'll start with, first of all, sort of acknowledging and thanking Scott and the team in bringing this up in advance of the strategic asset allocation review, because this is certainly something that should be reviewed in that context. So addressing first the challenges of simplicity and structuring around this, to a certain extent, an outsider might look at your portfolio and say that you've been doing opportunistic investing for a long time. You've had an innovation portfolio for over a decade. You've had a CIS portfolio for several years now. Those, for all intents and purposes, are opportunistic-like strategies and allocations, the way they're often defined and governed in the marketplace. And so, arguably, expanding this, creating controls and policies around it gives you an opportunity to simplify existing practices within your policies today. In terms of current best practices around allocations to these types of asset classes, and Ms. Erden sort of foreshadowed this in her comments, the current best practice in the industry is to have a 0% target in a range of 0 to 5 or 0 to 7.5% to it, largely because that allows you as a policy board to avoid the very challenging discussion of policy risk associated in an allocation that by its very nature is opportunistic, and that you're not going to be able to define in advance exactly the types of risks that are in there. What that necessarily means is that the size of this allocation would be within limits set by the board, governed by staff's investment decisions, and the risk taken in the portfolio would be controlled by staff. Getting back to, these all sort of tie together, getting back to the discussion on active risk, this is staff active risk. And so the creation and expansion of this type of allocation is in line with the broader discussion on the appropriate level of active risk in the portfolio, and the latitude that you provide staff in executing the investment policy that you set as a board. So this is sort of in line with those discussions, and another great reason to align this discussion with the asset allocation policy and net zero as well. The next thing I'll highlight on benchmarking, as we've reported back to you over the last year, the feedback that we've received thus far from the board is a strong desire to migrate towards more of a single one fund benchmark framework. An allocation to an asset class like this also plays into that approach of looking at, from a policy perspective, the risk and expected return of the portfolio at first and foremost the total portfolio level, and assigning a benchmark for staff at that level as opposed to each individual asset class. The final thing I'll say is, even with a 0% allocation, as long as there's actual dollars in this, and there will be, because you have actual dollars in innovation and SIS already, there should be significant thought and discussion around policies created within this asset class. So even an asset class with a 0% target has an asset class policy associated with it, and those controls and processes should be and will be kind of thoughtfully discussed through this. So that concludes my my comments on it.
Just more of a comment on this one, but I assume, given our transition and the strong mandate we now have to a transition to net zero, that everything we do in any new asset class will incorporate those goals. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely.
So even though it's not specifically in SIS, it would still have all of the disclosure requirements, all of sort of the if what's at risk, what's been disclosed before we're willing to invest in anything new.
Absolutely. That's asset class organization-wide.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Karen.
Well, let me try this one. Okay. I know that we talked about this analogy when we had our conversation earlier, but it just kind of, it's confusing to me, and I agree with it should be more simple, a more simplistic approach. And then, so you've got buckets, you've got asset classes, and then the missed opportunities are going to be caught by the opportunities portfolio. And so at the end, the optimal structure is for all this opportunities portfolio to catch all those missed opportunities. Is that right? Is that how I read this?
It would
kind
be,
of?
yeah, I think the opportunities portfolio is capturing some of the opportunities,
Okay.
but quite possibly not all of them.
Okay.
But as we evolve, we could either increase that portfolio, or we could evolve to a different, more streamlined structure.
Okay, so then what you're saying is the buckets of our 8 asset classes as currently described, they could get bigger? Could they get bigger so that they will catch all those opportunities that are missed?
Well, yes, I mean, that could be a solution, which is we have an organization-wide solution, as Steve was mentioning, as he,
Right.
you know, as we think about the benchmarks, if they're more flexible by nature, perhaps we don't need an opportunities portfolio, but it just happens organically within each of the asset classes, as an example.
Okay, so because then by not having an opportunities portfolio, then we don't need to have that governance structure and do all those other things that we require the current asset classes to do, correct? I mean, they would move, this little bucket would move up to the top, right?
Yes.
So then the little opportunities portfolio would have to follow all the rules that the other asset classes follow, as far as governance, policy, benchmarking,
yes.
and all that.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so if we do what happens then if we don't do the opportunities portfolio and then just make some of those buckets bigger?
Well, just to be clear, when we.
Yes, I'm not, because you do this 24/7, and I do this as a learning process. So I'm just trying to understand why we can't fit those drops in those other buckets.
Yeah, and I think that I wouldn't draw necessarily the analogy that we're making these asset classes buckets bigger, but I would say that there's a different structure that might be involved in that. The structure would involve having more flexibility around benchmarks. The structure would involve streamlining our policies and perhaps delegating more risk management, active risk management to staff. And that would involve us to create a different set of risk and risk reporting. That's the optimal structure. So all of those components need to come together for that. An interim solution would be for us to create an opportunities portfolio. And the advantage of that would be that we could start at small scale, which naturally would help us mitigate the risks. We could continue to prove out the concept and be more progressive. We could do that as well on the other side of it, but it would open up a lot more possibility on that side of it naturally. So those are the two ends of the structures.
But we could also do that through the asset allocation study as well, right?
Yes.
I mean, we could look at it a little bit closer and more, more definitively, I guess, in that process.
Yes.
Okay.
And we could look at both different ways to structure this, an opportunities portfolio versus just creating the total fund more sort of opportunistically and flexible. But we thought that might be a little farther in terms of an evolution than just creating an opportunities portfolio.
But if we already have the next slide of the CIS new opportunities and the innovative strategies, we've already got something in place. So we've got a base, we've got a structure in place. So can we do something like change the policy to make that even bigger or better?
Yeah, spot on. That's what we're thinking about doing is and that way we could simplify it and consolidate it. So that would be a follow-up.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah, Karen, those are great insights because I actually think that's exactly kind of even when Jennifer started off the conversation, right? Is there I think that's the question. It's not an action item for today, but I think you've gotten plenty of feedback from the investment committee in terms of food for thought for continuing conversation, but it does tee up the conversation for the asset liability study. I think all these things are kind of coming together as we start this next cycle of the year. But I think I am sure Makita will weigh in too in terms of advice around, do we stick with what we've got? Do we create this new bucket? Like you said, I thought you actually finished the conversation quite well. So I think that's the conversation. Do we create this? Do we not? What are the pros and cons? So thank you for that. And thank you, committee, for input. I think you've gotten plenty to think about. So thanks, Scott. All right, great. Let's move on to Chris and the CIO report.
Thanks, Mika. So we started this fiscal year in fairly good shape. I know the Kentucky Derby's this weekend, and so I'll use that analogy of going around the track. By the midway poll in December, we were up 19 billion on our way to 7%, and I was feeling really good. And then we suddenly hit 2022. And I warned you, I was worried that it was going to be a choppy year. And sure enough, we have seen that. That 19 billion has a lot of it has gone away. We are only up about 3 billion now fiscal year to date. So barely a 1% return. April was a particularly rough month for everything. Just some quick stats to share. In April, U.S. stocks were down almost 9%. I'm looking small. Yeah, there we go. 8.97 year to date, which is probably amazing. The Russell 3000 is down 13.8. Non-U.S. stocks, not as much. They're down about 11, but still down. Bonds are down 9.5. So far 22 is turning out to be a pretty darn rough year. And as has been pointed out, energy is up. Energy is actually up 18, unfortunately. So volatile times. When I run through the slides, Jonathan, that's not it yet. There we go. That's the year. We're still pretty smooth in the asset allocation. As I've shared with you, notice the light blue global total public equity is coming down. So we're now at 14% in real estate, 14% in private equity. We're increasing the exposure to inflation sensitive, which is that bright pink line. And those getting wider are what's pushing the equity down, which is good. So we're less volatile. An important slide we wanted to share, which is inflation. Think back with me 40 years ago, believe it or not, in the 1980s, some of us were around working as a chief investment officer. I know, it's a long time ago. But 40 years ago, high inflation. People will remember odd and even gas days. Yep, a lot of nodding heads, the gas lines. So highest level we've seen since that time period. We talked before about whether it was transitory. The Federal Reserve Chairman, Jay Powell, has said he acknowledges it's not. It's here to stay. It may have peaked at 8, hopefully, knock on wood, but we'll see still inflation above 5 throughout this year. You heard yesterday they went up 50. He said they'll do another 50 for the next several meetings. So they're going to, we're in a rising interest rate environment. Wall Street celebrated that yesterday, and then today they're giving it all back and then some. So rising interest rates environments are usually tough, hard to make money. Bonds struggle, certainly. And stocks do well at the beginning, but then they struggle. And I think we're in that struggling period. So we've only got 2 months here, less than 2 months before we hit June 30. And we're going to be limping to that finish line. I honestly can't tell you whether we'll have a positive or negative return. It feels like one of those years we had a couple of years ago where it literally depended. June 30 was a positive 1% up day, and that moved us from a negative to a positive return. So it may well depend on June 29 and 30 on how we do on the year. The thing I wanted to show here is just it's all about inflation. The labor market is very strange to me, and I asked a lot of people at the Milken conference about it. We have over 5 million workers that are missing. Half of them are baby boomers who have chosen to retire now. And the question is, with inflation so high, will they stay retired? But keep it, I'm sure you're all aware of restaurants that are understaffed and service is incredibly slow. And any kind of entry-level worker area is short-staffed and all the help wanted signs. The baby boom is not going to go into those jobs. But that means we have 2.5 million people who have chosen not to work. We know from the stats from Bank of America that savings accounts, checking accounts, much higher balance than before. So people have cash on hand due to the stimulus, but that's going to go away quickly. So we're going to have to see this summer what happens to those workers. Do wages rise to meet their needs and demands? If that happens, then we have another round of inflation. The Fed can't fight the supply chain problems by raising interest rates. They're just, the lockdown in Shanghai is just a lockdown. The Fed has no control in that. But rising wage inflation is something they can fight by higher interest rates. That means the economy, they've said they're going to sacrifice the economy to support, to fight inflation. So Wall Street sometimes doesn't pay attention to that, but I think that's something we're very focused in on. And then I realized I added this to the chart. These slides have to be due about 2 weeks early, so I feel good. Gail, I used the word transition, but this is a big shift, not only in the USA, but around the world. The war in Russia has shown us how dependent the world is on fossil fuels in other places. People are rethinking nuclear. People are rethinking. The big focus, the big takeaway for me is electricity has got to get green and get off coal. And that's the middle, that's China and India, and then certainly Eastern Europe. And what, was very clear to me from all the different speakers. Natural gas, as much as that is very much a fossil fuel, but it has to be the transition fuel. You can't just go cold turkey off coal to solar because you have no battery storage for at the nighttime. So it's going to have to be a transition fuel, whether people like it or not. Then hopefully by 2040s, we're getting into pure, clean sources of energy. So when you look at the charts, I wanted to raise your attention to, sorry for the delay. In the PowerPoint or in the packet, it is page 141, if that helps. In the CIO report, it's page 14, but it's market volatility. And it's really hard to read that upper chart other than market volatility spikes in the gray areas. And we certainly remember 2 years ago in March. Note that in the lower graph where they zoom in, we are having that market turbulence appear again. And so that's why I'm worried we may be in for a rocky ride between here and probably all the way out to the fall. And we'll have to hold our breath at June 30. All of the risk budgets, which are in there, so start paying attention to those all the time. Glance at them, quick, easy read of a gauge. You see the range and you'll see where we're at, so you can monitor the risk budgets of each of the public asset classes. I'm open to questions.
Thanks, Chris. Gail.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I agree with you on and thank you for the transition and the other risks. The only thing I think I disagree with a little bit, and I think folks aren't quite sure what to do with inflation now, is this idea that wage inflation causes higher inflation. So I think there's sort of two schools of thought on that. So I would just maybe see if we can correct that a little bit. So I think some of the labor market dynamics are that folks are looking for higher wages. I don't know that it's that correlated, that if they get some higher wages to get into the service industry, we're automatically going to see greater inflation. There's a big chicken and egg argument here. So I just think maybe the idea of inflation and wages are a little more nuanced, and this could be a correction in the labor market. So
True. You could have, if the economy slows down, those help wanted signs will disappear. My only point is you have cost push, which we've seen because of the supply demand shocks. So the base cost pushes up, but now you could have a labor pull on inflation. In other words, another leg that comes. If the demand is strong, they may have to raise wages to bring those people back. But you're right, the jobs could disappear. If the economy slows, you don't need that labor at all. And they could come back to work.
But even further, you could keep the demand, keep the labor needs, increase wages, and you may not necessarily see the correlated wage. So there's a third leg to your story, where like wages could increase without the correlating increase in inflation. So
without prices going up to make up that.
Without prices going up, correct. Because I think prices have risen now faster than wages. Yep. So the question is, can wages go up to meet that price demand? Mm-hmm. So I don't necessarily think, as we've seen in the past, and certainly as we saw in the 70s, wage increases will cause greater inflation. This could be a different inflation cycle we're in because of the supply chain demand. So I think it's really important that we are careful not to say wage increases cause greater inflation, because I don't know that we know that with the 22 inflation.
Fair point. And the fact that it's a global economy.
Yeah. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Elmer.
Let's go. Any other questions for Chris? These are interesting times, Chris. Very interesting times.
Very interesting.
So, but thank you for that. We'll look forward to, watching what happens in the next few months. When does the Fed meet next? Do you know off the top of your head? Is it June?
It's June.
Every couple months?
June 24th, end of June.
Okay, interesting. Great, thanks, Chris. I don't see any other questions, so we'll move on. Thank you. Item 7, and I should ask, are there any members of the public? Samantha?
There are no members of the public.
Great. Okay, thank you. We're going to move to consent items. The committee work plan, you can take a look at that committee work plan. How consent works is if you want to pull anything, we'll pull it. Otherwise, we'll take it on consent. You want to pull it? Okay.
I have a question.
Sure. So a question on the committee work plan for 22-23. Karen?
One of the things that I talked about in the briefing was the work plan, and I know that, maybe it's not this. Nope, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No
Sorry.
problem.
Sorry.
All right. So seeing no one else, although I lost my, that's okay. I'll figure it out. Seeing no one else chiming in, I will take the work plan as approved. And then we've got items 8 through 10 are consent agenda action items. So we'll take them all together unless anyone wants to pull those items. I don't see anyone wanting to pull those items. So I think we can just take a voice vote, right, Brian? We don't have to do a roll call. Okay. So for items 8 through 10, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, Steve, we have approval of items 8 through 10. Item 11 is the review for information requests. Steve?
Yeah, so on item 3, we had the series of requests for more specific information relating to costs and risks relating to the net zero transition plan. So as to sort of inform the board on the further active decision-making relating to asset allocation or policy changes that are necessary with respect to net zero. We also had a request for any available data or metrics regarding the, our portfolio carbon emissions in order to help better communicate with membership. So
Great.
those are the two.
Any other? Oh, go ahead,
I
Gail.
just, I would say that it's not just on net zero, it's specifically how the board could speed the transition. So it's a little bit more specific on timeline. I think the team understood that.
Very good.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And then item 12 is the draft agenda for the next, oh, did you, oh,
I'm sorry.
okay. No, that's okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think everything went so quickly as far as the consent. I just, if I can go back to item number 10.
Brian, sure.
Charter
Yeah,
review.
of course.
Can I do
And then-
that? Okay.
Sure.
I never noticed this before, but I brought this up in a previous conversation about CalSTR's participation with the SEC and global issues. And it's probably somewhere implied in the charter, but I wasn't sure if it is and if it should be. Our involvement, our participation, the things that we need to do concerning the SEC proposal that we're going to be responding to, like the other global issues that are implied. I know we do it, but I don't know if they need to be included in the charter. And I never noticed it before, and maybe I'm totally off target.
And maybe, Brian, you could help us with, the sort of, Karen's, like, what's the definition of the charter, the purpose of the charter? Because I guess, maybe connected to that.
Does it need to be?
There is a charter for the investment committee, and we can review that and get back to you. I mean, I'm trying to do it on the fly, but I think really you're asking for an information request and for us to come back and lay out for you the authority for doing this.
And the nuance, because I talked to Karen about that, the retirement board, if it lists engagement with federal regulators and things, does that cover the investment committee, or should the investment committee have a specific item in its charter related to engagement with SEC and regulators on matters? So,
I know probably the best model would be delegated, as opposed to the investment committee actually doing the engagement.
Okay.
So that's why I'd like to take a look at it, make sure we get the language right.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Great.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, no worries. So we're at item 12, which is the draft agenda for the next committee meeting, which will be in person here in July. And again, just like yesterday's regular board meeting, Chris, if you have any new comments, but in general, we tend to look at it's really the start of our next fiscal year. So we tend to look at work plans. So that will be the bulk of the conversation.
Yeah, the focus will be on the work plan. It will be on our business plans. Pleased to say the business plans integrate nicely into the CalSTRS strategic plan, so it's a big loop. We'll make that item pretty quick, generally about 20 minutes, because we spend most of it talking about the collaborative model and cost projections. And I think it's an important inflection point on the collaborative model of whether we go full force or partial. And then we're teeing up already the next year's asset allocation study. I think the discussion we had about net zero, the discussion about an opportunity portfolio, as well as Harry has asked us to look at the risk of extreme outside events. The Russia attack of Ukraine has brought to light that, there are geopolitical issues that can dramatically affect us. When we run the asset allocation, we run it through extremes, but we don't tend to look at those outside boundaries. And I think it's probably good to revisit. We said 2008 we thought was a once in 100-year event. When we went back and studied it, it's really more of a 1 in a 70-year event. 70 years is a long time, so I get it. It's not present mind, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to happen next year, and it could even happen 2 years in a row. So I think we just need to, it's back to math and doing statistics. Standard deviation is 2/3 of the range of the outcomes, but that means there's 1/3 on either side. We love the upside. That's all good news. 27%. Thank you. We can bank that. But we need to talk about the negative and the downside and think about how that affects the funding plan. So it's going to be a very robust year of asset allocation debates, looking at, unfortunately, really extreme negative outcomes. But that doesn't mean we understand them, but it doesn't mean we tilt the whole portfolio anticipating them, because it is a very low probability.
Eyes wide open. Thanks, Chris. Cassandra, just remind me, I think that the dates for the July meeting are July 7th and 8th, correct?
It's the Thursday and Friday, yeah.
Correct. Okay, so I just want to make sure everyone has that on their calendar. So I have July 7th and 8th is going to be our next, because it says TBD on the agenda. So I just want to make sure everyone has that in their calendars. Great. All right.
July 4th, too.
Right before that, yeah. With that, I believe we are adjourned from open session. We will take a break as a board, and we will go into closed session at 1:00. And then I believe board governance, Jennifer, what time are you guys?
2:45.
2:45. So I just want to give the public a cue that we'll be in closed session after lunch until approximately, you know how the closed session works?
2:30.
So we'll be in closed session until about 2:15. So members of the public, you have lunch from now until 2:15. And then we will have board governance at 2:30. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Representing the Director of Finance, Ms. Miller.
Here.
Chairperson Urdan, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Okay, so moving to agenda item 1 is our agenda. Any comments, or do I have a motion to accept the agenda as is?
We'll move with flexibility.
Second.
Okay, move with flexibility by Gail and seconded by Denise. And with that, we'll move forward. Item number 2. Oh, and for the agenda as well. Thank you. All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. The motion carries. For agenda item number 2 is a consent agenda action item. Would anybody like to pull it? No. Did you move for approval by
yes.
Gail? Seconded by Sharon. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Okay, item number 4, sorry for my eyes, action item. And this is the continuation of the board and committee meeting format discussion. Didn't carry with the same consent? Do we need to do 2 and 3 separately, or did that carry for both?
That was my bad. Sorry.
Okay.
You're fine.
Okay, great. Item number 4, so a continuation of our board and committee meeting format discussion. Amy will be leading us through the discussion. It is also together with Catherine, who will be participating over the video. And the goal of everything here is consistent with the principles that we've also just approved, and together with the look that we've been taking with the learnings that we have toward continuing to improve and build on our transparency, our effectiveness, and build efficiencies where we can. And again, not losing sight of our goal of excellence in serving all of our duties and doing them very well. So with that, Amy, I'll turn it over to you to start the discussion.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll make sure that, yes, the microphone is on. Terrific, okay. We have a PowerPoint, and it is up. We provided a number of materials for this item. Madam Chair, as you said, it's a continuation, and so we've had this multi-step process. And before I continue, let me just make sure, Catherine, that you can hear us and that we can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Yes, we can. Terrific. Okay, we have a connection here. Great. And so the arc of this started before the Board Governance Committee actually convened for this fiscal year, and it started at the offsite, where the board wanted to revisit and rethink some of the assumptions, longstanding assumptions, and see, given how quickly the world is changing and how quickly it continues to change, how can you leverage some learnings? How can you leverage flexibility and adaptability while still making sure that you have confidence as a board that you're responding to addressing the responsibilities of your board plate? And we talked about that at the offsite too. So that's the first part of it, was as we look at our board plate, are we covering everything? And then what opportunities do we have to be more effective, more efficient, more transparent, with the understanding that CalSTRS has always been a leader in those areas relative to governance? So this would be along the lines of a continuous improvement. And again, the steps that we've taken, there's 3 in the process. The first was to get a scope together in terms of how we wanted to approach this and how we wanted to support the committee, the direction that we received from you at the November meeting. Between the November and the March meeting, we conducted a survey of trustees, and we received your perspectives on a wide variety of areas. And you probably saw in the PowerPoint, in the appendix, we provided a summary of the input. At the March meeting, we shared the January meeting, I should say, the January Board Governance Committee meeting. We shared the draft operative principles and got some initial impressions from the committee around what changes you might need to make or want to have made. Then at the April offsite, we came to the full board because the strategic plan had just been adopted. And one thing that we learned from a peer practice was to have an intentional discussion with the board to align the strategic plan priorities with your work plan. And so that's what we did at the April meeting. And indeed, when we looked at the results of the post-meeting survey that we conducted after the April offsite, there was overwhelming satisfaction with that process and the opportunity to interact with your executive staff in formulating what the priorities should look like next year. And so now here we are today at this point to do two things. The first is to share an initial recommendation about the work plan, the board plate. And then the second is just to get some direction on where should we go next. And we provided a suggestion for your consideration. And so we want to take this in two parts, really. The first part is to talk about some of the adjustments we've made for the work plan for FY 22-23 and why you should have confidence in those. And then the second piece, again, is just we'd like to bring a range of options. We think there's more that we can do here. And I especially want to thank the executive staff because we've been working closely with them, the committee liaisons, to go through each of the work plans and to talk about routine items and talk about strategic items and how those fit in. So, indeed, this has been a jigsaw puzzle, and bringing it all together is what's most important today in getting the committee's direction. So I'll move forward into the presentation quickly here so we can get to step one. I've covered this already. What I want to make sure that the committee knows and feels comfortable with is that we did a really rigorous analysis, again, with executive staff, because what's most important is the board addressing the topics that it is required to address by law? And then are there forward-looking strategic and risk-related items that you should be addressing as a matter of best practice? And so we have to start there. What's on the board plate? And that's what we've done. The other thing I wanted to point out is that you have a number of what's called here structural evaluated mechanisms, which must have been our fancy three-letter or three-word phrase for you have feedback loops, and they're built in. We do a post-meeting survey after every one of your meetings. You have the offsite coming up in October where you can tell us if you're satisfied with something or not. So I just wanted the committee to be aware that those are in place too. And why I'm saying that and why it's important now to say that is that I think that gives you better flexibility to pilot things, to put new things, new practices into place and feel comfortable that you can give us feedback on a real-time basis and that we'll be responsive to that. So that's why that was a key consideration. So moving into the work plans, and this was attachment 1 in your book. And this was essentially the same work plans that you've seen through the other committee conversations that you've had yesterday and today. So we took great care to align them. What you see in the red are some of the suggestions for just shifting things to create more efficiencies without losing the transparency and effectiveness behind it. And then you also saw that the chart with X's that we all are familiar with from the April offsite, and that we've built in those strategic priorities where the board might need discussion. What we're going to be working with the executive staff between today and the July meeting is to get a better understanding for how those strategic objectives would be addressed through your regular board and committee meetings. And that would include any education that you might need in alignment with the strategic initiatives. And, that's a really wise way to do it instead of potentially waiting for the offsite next year to try to lump education items into one day or waiting potentially for the October offsite, because each of your strategic priorities has their own runway. So the general adjustments we made as we look through the work plan for this next year were to look at your operative principles and think about what those told us about how you wanted to do your work and what was important to you. And then we looked at the trustee survey sentiment, which is in the appendix of this presentation, and you can see the 4 categories that we queried you on. Some of those areas didn't have consensus, and some did. And so we took a risk in some areas to make a decision one way or another. And you may not like the decision that we made, or you may. And so that's the idea today, is just to get a snapshot and impressions from you on what you think. Specific adjustments to the draft work plan, and there's a lot of words here. So again, I'm not gonna go through all of these, but we really did a deep dive with the executives. We talked, I know, with Chris and Scott on the investment committee side, as well as Brian, about some reports that the board had been receiving. Your RMS report, for example, could that be combined with the CIS report and done on a semi-annual basis? And the answer was that everyone had a comfort level around yes, we think that probably can be done. So there were some changes made like that, just to adjust the frequency of the legacy reports or information items. Your annual fiduciary training is another example where many of you said, you know, for this next year, we might be okay just taking that offline, right? And so that's the kind of change specifically that we made to make room for some of these strategic plan priorities where you might have education that you need, or you might have additional discussion around some principles or definitions. So we maintained your current cycle of board meetings and your 2-day rhythm. In basically everywhere where we saw a consensus in the survey results, we tried to keep those things intact. So those are my words. There's words on the slide that I know everyone read through, but I think overall we have a good starting point for your discussion. And again, we ended up with 2 different steps here. And I wanted to focus on step 1 first, because I think this one, in many ways, is an easier one. And the reason I say that is because what it focuses on is just shifting the practice of having 2 offsites to every 3 years, which is, I have to say, if you look over the past 5 years, the last time you had 2 offsites was in 2018. And that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And so thinking through this practice that every time the board adopts a new strategic plan, it'd be wise to have that conversation with your executive staff to reset the slate of priorities in alignment with that next strategic plan. We really felt strongly that that'd be a really good practice for you to have. That doesn't preclude you from having an offsite if you all determine that you want to have an offsite, or calling a special meeting on a specific topic. But our recommendation would be, again, given your principle of adaptability and seeing how you reacted last year when you created a special meeting and convened around an investment topic, or when you had the CEO search, for example, you've leveraged that flexibility in the past. And so here what we're doing is we're saying, let's have the philosophy where every 3 years we're going to commit to having it for that purpose, and not have an offsite every year unless you decide that you need it. So that's what step 1 is about. Yes, step 1 is about eliminating the second offsite, except for in every 3rd year when you adopt a strategic plan. And so in total, you see that reflects 7 meetings, including 6 regular meetings and 1 offsite. So that's our recommendation. And the reason it's an action item is that in order to make this happen, you'd need to have a vote to change the board meeting calendar for the 22-23 fiscal year. And that would have to be a full board vote. So by you approving that today as a committee, that would advance that affirmative action to the July board meeting. So I'll press pause there. I've been talking a lot. I want to hear what the committee has to say just about step 1, and then we can talk about step 2 separately.
Terrific. And Amy, I might clarify too, please correct me if I'm wrong, is in the spirit of adaptability and flexibility, the proposal on the spring offsite is for the agenda that we've generally pursued at the spring offsite. So for the remaining meetings, should it be decided that it be held in another location, calendared, another location, et cetera, we could always do that if there was value in holding more than one meeting out of this meeting room. But the concept is to take the meeting that aligns with the strategic agenda, move that to be once every 3 years, aligning with the strategic plan. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. All right. Comments, reactions, questions? Sharon?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate the clarification. Because I really like as I've mentioned yesterday, I think in having things tied to a purpose and a process, right? So I like that idea of having that flexibility. Is the intention though, I guess, in that second offsite every 3 years to do the strategic planning conversation that we had this last spring? Is that the intention?
Yes.
Even though we could, like Jennifer said, we could use it for something else, but that's the intention, is every 3 years, that second additional spring offsite would align with the strategic plan, but also we would be discussing the strategic plan, correct? Is that,
So,
okay.
Madam Chair, Ms. Hendricks, yes, that's the idea, is that the
Okay.
same
Conversation you had last month, where you went through each objective and talked with each other about what the priorities are and where board involvement and time would be needed. That's the idea, is that that's the next step that we think you should be taking after you adopt a strategic plan. So that would be the anchor, if you will. If you think of the mall concept, that would be the anchor of the agenda for that second offsite every third year.
Foods of the offsite? Okay, got it, okay.
You can pick whichever store you'd like, yes.
I like that idea. I think honestly, I mean, I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because I think getting this right, because we had one offsite, then we added one. We've just, over the 10 years I've been on the board, it's kind of like our board book too. I feel like we're always retooling it to try and figure out efficiencies. I think the challenge is that, people aren't efficient, and I think it's figuring out. So I'm just mindful we're gonna have a new board member in July. Ken's fairly new, and I know, so we'll have the fall offsite. So the offsite just lends itself to a really different experience, I think, of the board, and obviously with the executives and the staff that attend that. So I think that's just in the back of my mind, knowing that we have flexibility and potentially, other staffing decisions in the future, we might, want to have another offsite. So having that flexibility seems important, so that we can, I just think there's a certain kind of, we talk a lot about our culture, and to me, a big part of our culture is when we have, what is it? Not meaningful time. What is that? Love language. You know what I'm talking about? There's a love language that talks about significant time. Oh, there's something time. Anyway, I can't think of it right now, but just having,
quality time.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. You read that 5 love languages book too. But yeah, it's quality time. And I think that's something that we get a little bit in here, but the offsite really, so thank you, Catherine. I appreciate it. I know you're, so that's the only thing I'm mindful of, is board culture, and just how much change we're having on our board with Joy leaving and that. And I just know those offsites lend to that. So I think if we're mindful of that, I would support us looking at a change for this year, with kind of maybe a caveat for looking, we look at the board calendar every year anyway, so we can certainly have those conversations. So thank you for the conversation. I appreciate you raising it.
Thank you, Sharon. And quick clarification, and maybe this is more to Brian, that were it voted to eliminate the spring offsite and hold that discussion about strategy aligned with the strategic plan once every 3 years, we could still, over the course of this next year, would still be open should it be decided to hold one of the other meetings at an offsite location, if that change in menu. Not that we would do that, but just in this, yeah, okay, so we would be eliminating an offsite and the topic. Okay, I just want to clarify what we're actually would be voting on. Thank you.
I think it's less legal and more
Schedule,
yeah.
well, on one of the remaining dates. No, not to change the dates, but anyway, that's okay.
I know exactly.
But no, just so we know what we're voting on, that's all. Okay, Karen is next in the queue.
Okay, thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Amy. So getting back to that question of when and where and all that, can you just tell me the dates that we're talking about? Because I'm kind of confused now as to every third year, every year, and when would be doing what.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Yamamoto.
Probably somewhere.
Yep. So attachment 3 is the CalSTRS meeting calendar. And so the dates we're talking about are April 5th and 6th of 2023. And those are dates that have been specifically set aside for a second offsite for next fiscal year. And that's what we're talking about removing for this next fiscal year. And your strategic plan is a 3-year plan. And so we just adopted it this year, so it's 2022, so 2025 would be your next, a 3-year offsite, it would be the next year where you'd have 2 offsites in a fiscal year. If that helps. So.
Okay.
So we always have the October offsite, and that's set because that's when we do the CIO
Right,
and
okay.
CIO eval. This is the spring, April offsite that we're talking about. So
Okay.
April 5th and
Okay.
6th.
Well, I was just confused as to what attachment we were looking at. I'm
It's all right.
sorry.
There's a few attachments.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, I don't see anyone else in the queue. Is there anyone else with comments, input, questions before we move to part 2?
Oh, I was going to make a motion to approve. If that's
Should we do them step by step or?
I think so. I'll second.
Okay, great. Moved by Gail, seconded by Sharon. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Great, thank you. Okay, step 2 for general exploration.
Yeah, for general exploration. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would say that the second step is all about information quality, is what it comes down to. And so I wanted to give you a bit of analysis that we did as we thought through your meeting calendar in light of the statement that everyone seemed to think it was a good idea to have 6 weeks, at least 6 weeks between your board meetings. And I remember, Sharon, you had asked me, what's the magic behind 6 weeks? And so I wanted to at least give you my perception of what that magic was. I know that in working as someone who produces materials for the board meeting books, there's a 4-week runway for board materials. And of course, Cassandra, if I'm misstating this, you can let me know. But on top of that, then you have the trustees that are preparing for the meetings and getting briefed on various documents, various items that you're voting on. And so all of that usually works out to about 6 weeks from soup to nuts. So when we look at your current fiscal year calendar, there are areas of compression. And then there are areas of what I would call expansion. So there are 5 times where your board meetings are 4.5 weeks apart, and 2 times where they're 5.5 weeks. So that's the compression, and it usually happens around the offsites. So if you think about how the fall series of events, you have a September meeting, an October offsite, a November meeting. So there's a lot of compression between those meetings, and then you have about 12.5 weeks before you meet again in the end of January, which is a significant amount of time. So you have other times between now and the July meeting, that's about 8.5 weeks. And so what we'd like to see is better consistency if we can, and also see if we can try to get 6 weeks, even 7 maybe, between the meetings. Now, if you just do simple math, and you say there's 52 weeks in a year, so why is this so hard? It becomes a lot more complicated when you think about other board meetings, the CalPERS board meeting, significant conferences, holidays. And I know that it also becomes difficult and challenging because all of you have personal lives that you're leading outside of the organization here. And so there's that kind of coordination as well. When we think about the information quality, though, especially in this time, when you have 4 weeks between meetings, there may not even be enough time for the natural next steps in a business cycle to unfold. And so the update that you're getting 4.5 weeks later, because of when the materials are due, may be very, very similar to the update that you just received this week. And so that's something that, from a governance standpoint, we look at and say, is that really the best use of the board? Are you getting the right information? And your executive staff is really good at providing communications that are timely and updates in between meetings, but we'd like to see if there's a better way to get some consistency around information quality by taking a look, generally, not for next fiscal year or any specific fiscal year, but could we look at spacing your meetings so we can address the information quality? We think it'll make it a better productive use for the board, as well as and I'll just say it because I know executive staff would probably not want to say it themselves, but it's hard when you're always in a meeting material cycle. They have other jobs that they're doing too. And so we want to be sensitive to ensuring that, Cassandra and Chris and Scott and the executive team are not just always producing materials, but that they have time to actually work on the strategic initiatives and keeping the trains running on time like they do and have to do every day. So I'm also mindful of the pressure it puts on you all to prepare, especially because you do have outside activities, commitments. So all around, I know that anytime we talk about meeting frequency, it's a very sensitive topic, but I just wanted to give you assurance before I turn it back to you, Madam Chair, that this is really about information quality. And indeed, after this item, we have another item that's going to talk about meeting materials. So, Madam Chair, back to you.
Thank you, Amy. And with that, I do once again want to repeat the oft-used words, adaptability and flexibility. So were any changes made later, it would always be, as Amy mentioned in her opening remarks, with the adaptability and flexibility and responsiveness should anything occur, in the interim that requires the board's attention. In the public. Great. Okay, with that, I have Sharon and then Lynn and anybody else, please join the queue if you have comments, perspectives, questions. Obviously a really important issue and we want to ensure to collect everybody's complete and candid thoughts. Sharon.
So I know this is impossible and maybe Amy, you can answer it because I won't put you on the spot, Cassandra. Do we have a board information quality issue currently? That is a question, because you're raising it, which I totally think is legitimate, but because I always like to kind of solve problems that we have. And so because I know when we've talked about this before, sometimes we've talked about it in terms of meeting frequency. And for me, it's really about a couple things. It's about efficiency. It's also, again, about culture and having touch points with the board and the staff and the building on a consistent basis. So we're not too out of touch, but maybe not too much. So I really like that conversation around balance of figuring out that sweet spot of enough time between. But I know in the past we've had times where we have a board meeting in November and we don't meet again until February because of Christmas or holiday break and things like that. And it's those gaps that I think are challenging because then it just feels like that's a steeper ramp to kind of get back on the saddle. And so I guess maybe if you could answer the first question, and I know it's an awkward one, but I think it's important for you to give your perspective as our consultant. And then secondly, I think what's hard is it's so hard to get our calendar set anyway. So I appreciate the caveat of flexibility. And yet I know just from experience that once we set the calendar, it's just so challenging to put in another date at some point once that calendar's set. So ask you that, Amy, if you wouldn't mind giving your candid thoughts about that.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair, Ms. Hendricks. So let me answer that in two ways. The first is from a technical perspective, because what I don't want to imply or suggest, and I know Catherine would probably make sure that I said this if she were here. I don't want anyone to think that your materials right now aren't of sufficient quality from a governance perspective. And I think from a fiduciary perspective, I would never want to put words in your general counsel's mouth, but they're always of sufficient quality to inform board discussion and seek your direction. And so that's not it. That's not what I'm suggesting. There's no technical issue with your materials. But experientially, the second part that I want to refer to, every time we run the post-meeting surveys, we're always picking up comments around just sensitivity around the number of updates that are provided to the materials, when they're coming in, when you get notified. And I think that's the type of surface bubbling that we look at to say, are you being well served by the timing here? Because if that is a consistent pattern across the post-meeting surveys, then that becomes something that I do think that we need to address. And so that's why we're bringing this up. Again, I know that meeting frequency is a very sensitive thing. We want to always make sure that you're meeting to conduct your board purpose. Right? And so I think we were very thoughtful in thinking about that, but it's again, those surface bubbles that we're looking at and saying, there's a pattern here and it's always around the updates. And we know that there's times of compression. We know there's times of extreme spacing. How can we do this better? So that's where this is coming from, Ms. Hendricks, and I hope that's helpful.
No, that's good.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate you bringing this issue up. I know it's always difficult with board calendars, and as Sharon mentioned, we've gone back and forth, different iterations of different boards and what we wanted to do. And I appreciate the fact of trying to space the meetings out for a minimum of 6 weeks. I think that that is important, but then we have that period at the end of the year where there's a long time between meetings, and it is hard. I think people do lose the thread, and especially with newer board members, it's harder to come up to speed. And I also want to share an experience from the CalPERS board. They went through this a couple of years ago, and it's been pretty bumpy. And they meet, when they have investment committee, they do meet 3 days, not 2 days. And investment committee generally goes from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 p.m. That's just one committee in one day. And so very long meetings, and in order to fit everything in. And I don't think that they have a lot of fat in the agendas. I don't think that they're adding things just to talk. But I do want to make sure that as we go through this process to review this, that we're careful to understand, what we actually want to cover and need to cover in the board meetings. And are we going to have sufficient time, or does it not allow for thoughtful discussions on important items? Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate those comments, Lynn. I think that's the lens that we would look through this, at least from the staff level and certainly from my level, that there is sufficient information and time to make those decisions that are important as fiduciaries and also consistent with your strategic plan. So that will be a lens that we will pass everything through. And I think that there is, I think that's part of this operation, is to try to decide which things are crucial, which things you do absolutely need to see, and which things you might not want to see or need to see. So that will always be our lens. I can tell you that I will always be looking over his shoulder on that.
Thank you. Brian has been all of our meetings as well. This has been terrific. Okay, Gail is next. And again, if I can do a quick check, if there's anyone else, please join the queue. But Gail.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is really helpful. I do think that fewer meetings may make sense just because there's such a balance with our teams of preparing for the board and then doing the work. And I like so I'm just trying to think if you've ever seen, or Catherine, just in terms of best practices, email updates to account. I know it's certainly not the same as meeting in person, and this is sincerely lovely. But I just wonder if, especially as we transition through, and I don't know if CalPERS tried this, but the idea of fewer in-person meetings with more frequent email updates as we transition to fewer meetings, so it's not quite as big a shock. So for example, with the investment team, that they do the big three. So in the intervening sort of, to account for the 2, I think we're missing 2 meetings, or is it 3 if we move to this? We would have 3 fewer meetings if we did 5 a year plus an offsite?
No, you would have 1.
Fewer regular meetings.
1 fewer regular meeting. So then I just wonder if there could be either like a little video update or anything, and obviously it would all be public, but just an interim step to account for the lack of meeting. I don't know if you've seen anything, but I do think moving to a culture of not being in constant kind of board preparation could be really helpful for our team to really get some of this other work done as well. So I like the idea of fewer meetings, but maybe to, just based on what folks are saying, some other update I think could be really helpful. I don't know if you've seen that before.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and Ms. Miller. I do think that, as Mr. Bartow said, looking at this as a package, and thinking about it from the perspective of if we're able to build this out for you, and there's a couple of different options. I've talked with Cassandra about perhaps maybe thinking of different months for board meetings. And so we have some ideas that we'd like to pen out, but also timing out the agenda, to your point, Ms. Paquin. I think, that would give us a sense for, can you even fit all of your board plate into 5 meetings? We don't have an answer to that yet, yes or no, but we'd like to find out if that's even possible. And then, of course, looking at it from the lens of, is there sufficient time? On top of that, you have to think about what do the communications look like in between meetings. That's a big part 2. And then part 3 of that is the cultural issue. How do you stay connected as a board? How do you keep the right level of momentum on certain projects? And so all of that would be part of this next range of options that I think we could work with your executive staff on and bring back more detail to you as a committee at the July meeting, so you can have something to look at and react to.
Thank you very much. That was all I had.
Madam Chair. Thank you. We have Sharon and then Denise and then public comment after that. Is that right? Okay. Okay, that's fine. Okay, great. Denise?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
It's moving.
Project that one.
I could just yell.
Pat, actually, we're talking the board members having issues with her mic. Yeah, okay. No worries. We've got a couple more people and then we will get to you.
Denise.
My mic didn't go on. I don't think she.
Mine's on now, so Denise could.
I know. Relearning everything.
Okay. Yeah, I think you got it. Okay.
Now let me remember what I was going to say. So I want to be very sensitive to the time it's taking staff to prepare packets, and I'm hoping that maybe we can come up with an idea on that. As far as cutting out meetings, I'm more than willing to not have the April offsite except for every 3 years. But I think especially just coming back from COVID, I think that we have all learned how valuable it is to be in person and be together. I learned so much from my colleagues and from staff just getting taught while I'm here and having sidebar conversations. I would hate for us to go too long between meetings and not have that opportunity. Yeah, I just wanted to definitely highlight the connection part and especially the board. I'm going to say it again. I think the time, and especially as we keep getting new board members coming in and out, and there could potentially be a lot more of that in the next year or two. I just think it's really, really important that we keep meeting as frequently as we can, actually. Obviously not overdo it. And for the people who've been here for a very long time, you'll remember these meetings used to be 3 full days, and I feel like we've already cut a lot out. So for our newer board members who don't know that, we've already put a lot on consent and not had a lot of presentations. So I just want us to be very sensitive to that. Additionally, having these meetings allows our constituents and the public to get the information items and to understand and see what's going on and how we're making our decisions. So I think we need to be sensitive to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Sharon.
So just, I guess, and I think I'm just glad we're having this conversation because I'm mindful that each one of us on the board comes to this board from different roles. Some of us are representing someone else. There's multiple people that sometimes serve. And so there's different, and some people on this board serve on a lot of boards, both in the public sector and in the private sector on their own time, so there's so I recognize people are dealing with different time demands and workloads and things like that. So I'm mindful of the diversity on our board. I think two things I'm just, I think Denise, you highlighted the culture piece. I think, I'm mindful too from Zoom on the pacing. Like today, if you notice, today and yesterday, our lunches were longer, right? So we had an hour and a half, 2 hour lunchtime. And that was kind of Harry's intention to try and carry over a little bit of the Zoom, the 2, 2, and 2 model. Although we don't, it wasn't 2, it was more like 3.5 to 3.5. But that model of trying to have a little bit more time at lunch. And so I think that pacing live now back in person, I think the translation of that is something to be mindful of moving forward, right? Because if we go to fewer meetings, in my head, I think it might not be, but if we have more content, then we might move towards like a 9 to 6 or potentially, and an hour for, which is, we've done that before, we can do it again. But I do remember those 3-day board meetings. And I know one of the reasons we made a choice to change it, at least for Harry and I, is we would never teach in a classroom like that. I mean, you just don't retain information, right, Ken? It's like, you just don't retain information. You need time for your brain to kind of unwind and do other things. So I think the pacing piece, however we want to, because I'm open to changing it, but just I think we have to be mindful of the pacing of the meetings and break times, culture. I do think just making sure that it's content driven. So it's not really about the number of meetings we have, but that it's content driven. So what do we need to talk about? When do we need to talk about it? How much do we need to talk about it? And then from there, that drives how many meetings we have, even though I think, you know what I mean? So that it's really about that. And I think your language around 6 weeks is really helpful because to me, that helps find that balance, I think, because you want the pacing to be right, but you also want it to be, I really think we need to come at the conversation through content versus how many meetings do we want to have a year. So not that we've been doing that. I'm just saying, like, to me, it's helpful to start with the end in mind, which is how do we do our work efficiently, effectively, build awesome board culture, allow our stakeholders a place to interact with us and hear from staff. So.
Thank you. Terrific. Thank you, Sharon. We'll now take public comment and then we'll come back to the vote with a reminder that the vote will be about whether to explore this topic and come back.
A retired teacher. And my concern is I don't really understand at the offsite you'll be making decisions, passing policy and this sort of thing. And so therefore, it becomes a different thing. You're going to move here and make all these decisions. It'll be somewhat hard for the experts in the group to follow you around and to be consistent. The nice thing about having, most of the meetings in Sacramento is that they're done and you're used to the routine. And I am concerned that here you're moving this way and you're making all these decisions that you lack communication. And also you've got the staff here. And so are you going to move all the staff with your offsite? And that might be quite expensive. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Terrific. Are there any other members of the public here in person or dialed in? Samantha? Okay. Absent hearing. Other members of the public? Amy?
No, Madam Chair, I was just going to say I don't think we need a vote on this step 2. We just needed consensus direction.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, terrific. So thank you. That was a terrific discussion and great input, I think, Amy. Thank you. For you and the executive team to take away. We're now going to move into some information items, also carrying along the same topics. The first one, item Number 5, yes. So Amy, if you'd like to lead the discussion, this is, as we look at our board materials, the template that's used for them. And we'll express some thoughts here, and again, for discussion and input before it's taken to the next step. Thank you.
It's, again, under the principle of information quality, and just taking a look at how the template that is the unifying factor for all of the materials that you receive across the board and all of its committees, what changes might be interesting at this point to bring forward to the template so that we can continue to enhance the quality of information that the board is getting and make sure that the information you receive is useful, but also to leverage some of the things like video, for example, on a pre-recorded basis, which I know investments has been doing and several other areas, and maybe use that a bit more to supplement or provide additional education materials. So what we did in the write-up, and it's page 2 of the write-up, was just to express some of the trustee survey sentiment that we received regarding the materials. And you can see those on page 2 of item 5. Some of them are here to move the recommendations up front, along with providing supporting rationale and key considerations, to use bullet point summaries for items that are presented and discussed. Certainly, for example, like consent items could be lengthier narratives. But that's something that was brought up as an idea to emphasize connection points with your key documents like the strategic plan, enterprise risk management framework, and your board policies and charters. So that was a suggestion brought forward. And then, as I already mentioned, providing easier access to optional reference materials. So that was some feedback that we received. And then also, in the prior PowerPoint, there was a summary of sentiment there too, and just again emphasizing having an abbreviated style of meeting materials, and that board and committee meetings should emphasize discussion time and not necessarily lecturing. And I think that's a principle that has been followed pretty well now. So the meeting materials template as it is just fine as it is. But again, what we're looking for is, in the spirit of continuous improvement, what ways can we enhance it? So I wanted to just share those with the committee, and then also say, do these still resonate with you? Things change rapidly. And so if you want to see something else, if you have a comment that gives us a bit more color or nuance on a bullet point that you see here, or something that you would find helpful, that's the kind of direction that we're looking for. Our next step would be to work with your executive staff on just making some changes, talking through some potential changes for this template. We would then bring it back to the committee in July just to share it with you. We wouldn't ask you to vote on it. But what we want to do is to try to find a rhythm that we can all walk into, with the understanding that through your post-meeting surveys, through the self-evaluation process at the offsite, that you'd have an opportunity to provide more feedback so we can iterate as we need. So, Madam Chair, back to you for additional commentary.
Terrific. Thank you, Amy. I have Lynn, and if other members of the board, of the committee, would like to provide input, comments, perspectives, please join the queue. Lynn?
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Amy. I really like the idea of putting the recommendations up front, and I like, making the reference materials easier to access. And I think that staff has been doing that, putting links in a lot of the documents at this point anyway. I guess the one that I'm really concerned about, though, is the one encouraging the use of bullet points rather than narratives. And just thinking about the memo on the net zero progress update today. I mean, I recognize it was a longer memo, but I don't see how that could have been just presented as bullet points. And so I think we have to be really careful about what we're asking staff to do, because I know that they obviously want to follow the board's direction as closely as they can, but I think that there's certain issues that you cannot move away from a longer narrative when it's warranted. And I have to say, I don't think that staff abuses it. I don't think that they're writing long memos just to write them. And I think I've noticed that the materials over the past couple of years have become much more concise. And then we have, certain issues like today that deserves a longer memo. So I would really hesitate to say that we want only bullet points. I think that would be very difficult to follow along with, especially if we're going to reduce the number of meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Sharon?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything you just said, Lynn. I have noticed a change. I think we've given a lot of feedback about materials over the years, and I just commend our staff. I think you guys have been listening to our feedback over the years. I really noticed in this meeting in particular, the presentations just being really concise and leaving a lot of time for discussion. So thank you, investment committee staff, and then folks from the regular board meeting yesterday. So to me, that's been great, but this is really relevant to how we prepare for the meetings and what we read through. So I do like those recommendations. Lynn, I think your concern about the second objective is a fair one, and so I would just trust staff to use judgment. And I haven't seen that as a huge issue, but I think the spirit in which I read that is helping us to kind of get to the meat on the bone. As I like to say, all protein, no empty calories. So, but I like it. I especially like bullet point 3, because I think for newer board members and even for those of us who've been around for a while, it's always good practice, I would assume, governance-wise, Amy, to kind of go, how does this align with our strategic plan and the frameworks and the policies? And I think sometimes, as a board member, it's just easy to take these things individually. And I think it's really important because our function as a board is to look big picture, strategic, and ensure that, our policies and procedures are in place. And so I really like bullet 3. So I would, encourage continued conversation with Amy, with you, with the staff. We just continue to improve in this area, and there's more to be done. But I just want to commend the improvement I've seen, especially just even in this current board meeting, that the conciseness of presentations has allowed us to, I think, to have really good conversations as a board, and I think come to some good, either further questions or direction for staff. So thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Karen.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Amy. Well, I like the bullet point number 1, the recommendation, first of all, right up the front. And when you say, and I like the supporting rationale as to, why we're doing this, what happens if we don't make this recommendation, and the key considerations as to what impact it has on the fund or to any other stakeholders or any other issues that might be concerning. I agree with Lynn about the discouraging of the bullet points, because to me, a lot of times, if it's a bullet point, staff could tend to just use acronyms or just do a regular statement. And so I think it's a way for the narrative to tell us the explanation a little bit clearer. I like number 3 because that's what we've been talking about, how it ties to our strategic plan, how it ties to our risk management. And then as far as the 4th bullet point, I really appreciate sometimes when there's a hyperlink in the item, so that if there's any further explanation, we can then click on that and find out more explanation, like maybe a prior legislation or a prior board item that this may be involved in, or things like that. So I really like the use of the hyperlink. So looks good. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Gail.
Thank you. I wonder, just 2 thoughts. One, on the bullets, if we're on bullet 1 in terms of the recommendations, just like a bulleted description, because I think we all learn differently. So I like the idea of having different ways that we're summarizing information, and then the more detailed information, just have a combination for different learning styles. I don't know, but I agree that a lot of the information is really useful to Ms. Paquin's comments. But then the other thought I thought maybe we had talked about including in here is a risk section, not for everything, and I don't think we should invent risks where there are none, but just to incorporate sort of this discussion of risk. Did I miss that? Oh, yeah, no, let's not increase risk unnecessarily. But just to the extent it's part of a template, so that part of the thought process for our team is, like, have I thought through every risk here? And that may be more relevant to investments, but I like the process in a template, like, have you thought about this when you're doing something online, or, before you leave a purchase, like you may like, just to trigger that thought for all of us. And then we'll know, I think as a board, we'll know that idea of risk has been considered. So I don't know if that works as something to add to a template. That's all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Terrific. Thank you, Gail. Any other comments? I don't have any others in the queue. Amy, does that provide the background? Terrific. Terrific. Okay, moving on to the next item. We're making progress. Item number 6, and this will look at the committee work plan for fiscal year 2022-2023. And Brian and Amy will take us through it. It's an information item.
I think your work plan for the next year. I'm on the bottom line. I'm the bottom half. So I think we need to concentrate on the top part first.
Robert, thank you. And of course,
Yeah.
In July, we're talking about the evaluation of the board committee format and evaluation of the meeting materials.
Yes, there it is. Thank you, Brian. Madam Chair and members of the committee. So what we did here was to construct a process where the board governance committee would be still meeting 3 times. Your prior cadence had been November, January, May. And because of this initiative that we're working through with the committee right now, we'd like to suggest to you that you meet again in July and not wait until November. And so your sequence would be for the 22-23 fiscal year, July, November, and March. And that would allow us to continue some of these good discussions that we've been having with you in July. So you can see the evaluation of the board and committee format. That was the first item that we had. And then circling back with the committee on maybe some of the suggested changes to the template, the meeting materials template for the July meeting. In November, in talking with Brian, we felt that maybe as a result of some of these conversations, there might be some policies that we would want to check back in on and take a look to make sure that they're in alignment. And so that's what that's about. There also may be potential committee charter revisions. There's a concept of board committees that through some of the strategic plan discussions that you'll be having in various other committees and at the regular board level, you may decide that there's a place for a new committee, or perhaps even spelling out how you create committees to begin with, or what the purpose of different committees or your teams of 2 are. So that's why we had that earmarked for November. And then March, of course, is just, we built in some progress evaluations on your meeting format, meeting materials, and then of course, looking at your 23-24 work plan for the next year. So that's kind of the high level summary that we had talked about. And if I missed anything, Mr. Bartow, please point that out.
Well, I think you're at the high level, of course, I think you've covered it. I'd just say that we spent so much time over the last several years revising the board policy manual into the board governance manual. And if you remember, Assistant General Counsel Jill Lukens and Katie Frank worked very hard on that. So I think one of the things it's not necessarily part of your work plan, but it's really a ministerial act almost every time we meet to see if changes that need to be made or updates. So that's always going to be something that we may ask to put on your work plan. That's separate from the November notation, which is really a deep dive into the board governance manual to be consistent with what you're addressing in the committee.
Terrific. Thank you, Amy and Brian. It is an information item, but if there's any comment? No. Okay. Sorry? Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yep. You're
okay. All right. So July, you mean July 22 we're meeting?
Yes.
And July November 22, we're meeting, and March 23, we're meeting. So that's why this calendar says 22, 23? Okay, all right. I just want to make sure that I was reading the numbers right. Thank you.
Yeah, we're July through June.
Yeah, because November to March is another year, right? Got it.
Calendar.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Karen. Okay, any others? I don't see anyone else in the queue, but just to be sure. All right. Item number 7, Braden, we obviously had a lot of input in terms of information requests. I don't think we had any. Okay, great. Item number 8 is our draft agenda for now the July 2022 meeting.
Move approval.
Great. Move for approval by Gail. Do we need to vote? It's not an action item. Okay, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. But we're moving quickly. We're ending ahead of schedule. Any other comments that anybody has on it? Otherwise, with that, I don't see any other members of the public. Samantha, we confirmed last time there was a microphone problem, but there were no members of the public. So I think with that, we can adjourn the governance committee. Thank you very much, everyone. Terrific discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.